Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into a world that photographs beautifully and would have killed most of us within the year. Edwardian England, top hats, tea sets, motor cars puttering past horse carriages, a nation that thought of itself as the most civilized on earth. And it was, in its way. It was also a place where the wallpaper could poison you, the milkman could infect you, and the friendly chemist on the corner would happily sell a tired mother a bottle of something that would quiet her baby permanently. Before we start, thank you to everyone who's been requesting this era in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight is for you. If this kind of long, slow, historical wind down is the sort of thing that helps you sleep, consider leaving a like, no pressure. Just helps the channel find the right ears. And tell me down below where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are, because there is always someone awake at 3 a.m. somewhere. Now get comfortable, pull the blanket up, let the room go quiet around you, and let your mind drift back more than 100 years to a narrow terrace street in a city thick with coal smoke, where the sun is only just starting to think about rising. You are about to live one day as an ordinary person in the reign of King Edward VII. Somewhere between 1901 and 1910. The exact year hardly matters. What matters is the cold currently settling into your bones, because that is where this day begins, in the dark, in the cold, in a bed that has gone stiff with the temperature of the room around it. There is no such thing as a warm house in this century. Not really. Coal can heat one room at a time if it's fed constantly and watched carefully, but the rest of the building simply surrenders to whatever the weather outside has decided to do. So when you wake, and you wake early, because everyone does, the first sensation is not comfort. It's the specific, particular cold of an English winter morning trapped indoors with nowhere to go. If you can see your breath above the blankets, that's normal. If the water in the basin beside your bed has a skin of ice across the top, that's normal too. Windows sweat frost on the inside overnight, and in the morning the glass looks almost decorated, delicate white patterns spreading across each pane. It's lovely to look at and slightly alarming to understand, because it means the only thing standing between you and the winter outside has done almost nothing to stop it. Whether this cold is a minor inconvenience or a genuine hardship depends entirely on which household you were born into. And this is a theme that will not let go of you all day. If you have money, someone else has already suffered on your behalf. A housemaid was awake and moving through the dark house a full 2 hours before you opened your eyes, raking out the ashes from last night's fire, laying fresh coal, coaxing a flame to life with hands that had gone numb doing it. By the time you stir, your bedroom has gone from lethal to merely brisk. There may even be a stone bottle filled with hot water tucked near your feet, or a metal pan of embers that was run briefly between your sheets before you climbed in, the Edwardian version of central heating. Except the heating unit is a human being who had to climb 3 flights of stairs to deliver it. If you don't have money, you are quite possibly that housemaid, or you are simply cold with nobody arriving to make it otherwise. You dress in a hurry, hopping between icy floorboards, throwing on layer after layer not for elegance but for basic survival, the way a person might dress for an expedition rather than a workday. Getting dressed quickly stops being about vanity and becomes an exercise in trapping whatever body heat you have left. And then there is the question of the chamber pot, tucked discreetly beneath the bed, because indoor plumbing is still very much a luxury item in this era, not a guarantee. The bathroom, if your house even has one, is often a separate, freezing little outbuilding at the far end of a yard, which on a morning like this feels less like a room and more like a punishment. Using the pot instead is quick, undignified, and universally understood not to be spoken about at breakfast. Washing, such as it is, happens in cold water. A splash to the face, a quick pass over the hands, teeth gritted the whole time. The idea of a full bath is something we'll come to later tonight, and it is rare enough that it deserves its own chapter entirely. For now, the goal of the morning is simple: get upright, get dressed, and get to the point where your own breath stops fogging in front of your face indoors. That, on a winter morning in Edwardian England, counts as a small personal victory. Once you've achieved it, once you're standing there stiff-shouldered and vaguely resentful of the entire concept of winter, it's time to do something about your face. And this is where the day takes its first genuinely dangerous turn. Fashion in this era has a very specific idea of what a respectable face looks like, and it is not a face that has seen much sun. Pale, smooth, untouched by wind or manual labor or the indignity of a suntan, because a suntan means you work outdoors, and working outdoors means you're poor, and poverty is the one thing nobody fashionable will admit to, even under torture. So the goal every morning is porcelain. And the road to porcelain runs straight through a chemistry set that would make a modern toxicologist take a large step backward. Start with the powder. Many of the whitening powders sold to respectable women through this period leaned on lead for their effect, because lead clings to skin in exactly the flat, matte, ghostly way the fashion demanded. The trouble is that lead doesn't stop at the surface. Given months and years, it works its way inward, and the results include gray, damaged skin, nerve problems, and with a cruelty that borders on comic, the very blemishes the powder was originally applied to hide. Which meant, naturally, that more powder went on top to cover the damage the powder itself had caused. It's the kind of closed loop most industries only dream of building. Then there were the little tablets sold under names like complexion wafers, sweets essentially, meant to be nibbled daily for skin that glowed from the inside out. Their listed ingredient, printed proudly on the box rather than hidden in fine print, was arsenic. The logic ran that a small daily dose gave the skin a certain translucent brightness. And it did, technically, because arsenic damages the tiny blood vessels sitting just beneath the surface. That glow wasn't health. It was early poisoning, and it happened to photograph rather well. For those chasing an even more dramatic effect, there was full enameling, a genuine coat of paint. Sometimes containing lead among other cheerful ingredients, applied across the face and neck for a flawless, mask-like finish suitable for an evening out. It cracked if you smiled too widely, so smiling widely simply stopped being on the menu. An entire evening of serene, careful stillness, achieved by wearing a light film of poison and refusing to let your expression move. And then the eyes. To get the large, dreamy, dilated look so admired in portraits of the period, some women turned to drops made from belladonna, a plant whose very name means beautiful woman, and whose more honest name is deadly nightshade. It widened the pupils dramatically and gave the eyes a soft, unfocused quality that read as romantic. It also blurred the vision for hours and with repeated use, did nothing kind for the eyes long-term. You couldn't see clearly across the room. You simply looked wonderful failing to. None of this was secret, exactly. Plenty of Edwardians suspected these products carried real risk. They simply decided, collectively, that looking pale and fashionable was worth more than looking common and healthy. So you finish your morning routine luminous, powdered, faintly poisoned, and ready to be judged on precisely that basis by everyone you meet today. And somewhere else in the house, a different kind of morning ritual is already underway, one with far less vanity behind it, and a great deal more quiet tragedy. A baby is crying somewhere nearby, and in this era, there is a very specific, very ordinary answer to that problem. Exhausted mothers, servants, and nurses across the country reach for bottled soothing syrups, sold cheerfully on every high street, promising calm and rest for a fretful infant. They worked extremely well. They worked well because a great many of them contained morphine or opium, dosed into infants with roughly the same casual confidence we'd use handing over a teething ring today. To understand why this became so normal, you have to understand the arithmetic these families were living inside. A working mother in this period rarely had the option of simply staying home with a crying child. She might be minding piecework, doing laundry for other households, or running an entire home alone while her husband worked. A baby that wouldn't sleep meant nobody slept, and nobody sleeping meant no work got done, and no work meant no food on the table by the end of the week. Into that impossible equation stepped the patent medicine seller, offering a bottle that promised silence for everyone. These products had gentle names and gentle promises, marketed for teething troubles, for colic, for the ordinary restlessness of infancy. The labels spoke of calm and comfort, and only in the smallest print, if at all, did they mention that the active ingredient was an opiate. A dose measured for a grown adult was being handed to an infant's tiny body, with no reliable standard from bottle to bottle and no real guidance on how much was safe. A loving, exhausted parent could give a fatal amount without ever intending harm, simply because nobody had told her otherwise. Doctors and reformers of the era did raise concerns. Medical journals wrote about it. Campaigners pushed for change. But regulation moved slowly. The medicine was cheap and easy to buy, and the desperate circumstances driving families to use it in the first place didn't disappear just because a warning eventually got printed on a label somewhere. It's worth sitting with how ordinary this was. Not a rare horror hidden away, but a bottle kept on the kitchen shelf in countless homes, used by people who genuinely believed they were helping their child rest. The tragedy here wasn't cruelty. It was a society that had made this normal, and then left the most vulnerable people in it, infants who couldn't speak for themselves, and mothers with no real alternative, to quietly carry the cost. And that same casual trust in a bottle bought over a counter didn't stop at the nursery door. Because down the street, the local chemist had a great deal more waiting behind the glass. If you're feeling unwell this morning, or simply feeling like treating yourself, the local chemist is only a short walk away. And in this era, a chemist's shop is less a modern pharmacy and more something closer to an unregulated bar for the nervous system. Laudanum for a cough, cocaine for a toothache, arsenic tonics for the complexion, all sitting on open shelves, available with a smile and remarkably few questions. Self-medication is close to a national pastime here, because so few of the rules we now take entirely for granted actually exist yet. Walk into the shop and take a proper look around. Colored glass bottles catch what little light comes through the window. Brass scales sit polished on the counter. Confident labels promise relief from every complaint known to medicine, and a few that medicine hasn't quite invented yet. Behind that friendly counter is enough sedative material to calm a small stable of horses. Laudanum is the great workhorse of the age, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, exactly as potent as that description suggests. It's reached for constantly, for coughs, for pain, for sleeplessness, for the fashionable vague complaint simply called nerves, and for the very real suffering of a period without much else in the way of pain relief. A few drops in a glass of water, and the sharp edges of the day soften considerably. It's cheap, it's everywhere, and it is quietly, thoroughly habit-forming, which means a surprising number of perfectly respectable, perfectly ordinary people are more dependent on it than they'd ever admit at a dinner party. Cocaine, meanwhile, has built itself a reputation as a genuine modern marvel. It appears in tonics, in toothache remedies, in preparations aimed at giving the tired a little lift before an afternoon of errands. There's a real, sensible use behind some of this. Dentists and surgeons have found it works beautifully as a local anesthetic, a genuine step forward for medicine. The trouble is everything built on top of that sensible foundation. The cheerful assumption that something useful in a surgical chair is equally suitable as a general pick-me-up for a tired clerk on his lunch break. And then, remarkably, there's heroin introduced by a major pharmaceutical firm and marketed, in complete sincerity, as a safe, non-habit-forming alternative to morphine. It's one of history's more spectacular miscalculations. It turns up in cough remedies, in preparations sold for children, sold by people who genuinely did not yet understand the danger sitting inside the bottle. This, really, is the recurring theme of the whole Edwardian medicine cabinet. Not villainy exactly, but confidence applied to chemistry nobody fully understood yet. Arsenic, of course, never really left the shelf either. Tonics containing it are sold to improve the constitution. The same underlying logic as the complexion wafers, just bottled by the spoonful instead of the tablet. You could, in principle, poison yourself gently for your skin, your cough, your nerves, and your general vitality, all before lunch, and pay a very reasonable price for the privilege. It's almost impossible to overstate how strange this looks from where we're sitting now. Imagine walking into a modern shop and buying, with no questions asked and no prescription required, a bottle of opium tincture, a cocaine-laced toothache cure, a heroin-based cough syrup, and an arsenic health tonic, then heading home to try all four before dinner. To us, that sounds like a dare. To an Edwardian, it's simply a Tuesday. Change is coming slowly. Laws will tighten over the following decades, campaigners will keep pushing, and the free availability of all this will gradually narrow. But for now, you leave the chemists with your little paper parcel and your bottle of relief, feeling considerably better already, which is, in its own quiet way, exactly the problem. And speaking of things about to enter your body without your fully knowing what's in them, it's time for breakfast. With your face freshly powdered and your nerves freshly medicated, breakfast waits. And breakfast, in Edwardian England, is something of a gamble, because a great deal of the food on your table has been quietly stretched, bulked, or dyed to make it cheaper to produce and more attractive to sell. The underlying principle is almost elegant in its simplicity. If a food is expensive, mix in something cheaper and sell the result at the original price. If that cheaper filler happens to be indigestible or mildly toxic, well, that's tomorrow's problem, not today's profit margin. Multiply this logic across an entire economy of tight margins and fierce competition between grocers, and you arrive at a breakfast table where almost nothing is entirely what its label claims. Take the bread first, the honest staple of the whole meal. To make flour stretch further and appear whiter, bakers were known to work in alum, a compound that bulks out the loaf and produces a pleasing pale color, while offering no nutrition whatsoever and doing the digestion no favors. Chalk turns up too, and in some of the worst cases, plaster. The bread ends up looking wonderfully refined, and refinement matters enormously here, because white bread signals a household doing well, while a gray, heavy loaf signals poverty. Move to the tea, that great national ritual. Cheaper blends were sometimes padded with already used leaves, dried out and resold as fresh, or blended with leaves from entirely different, non-tea plants altogether. To give the brew the right rich color, some batches were tinted using compounds that had absolutely no business anywhere near a teacup, including, in certain cases, lead-based dyes. You pour a pot expecting comfort and civility and get, quietly, an unlisted extra ingredient along with it. The milk deserves an entire chapter of its own, and it's about to get one. For now, simply know it was routinely watered down, and that the water used for the watering wasn't always especially clean either, which rather undoes the whole point of adding milk to begin with. Sugar sometimes arrived stretched with sand or other cheap white powders. Butter might be padded with lesser fats and dyed to the correct golden shade to pass inspection at a glance. And if breakfast included a sweet treat or a jar of brightly colored preserve, it's worth knowing that some of the most vivid dyes of the period leaned on genuinely toxic compounds, including copper and lead salts. As a rough rule, the more vivid the color on your plate, the more suspicion it deserves, a difficult lesson to explain to a child holding a boiled sweet the exact shade of an emerald. Laws existed against the worst of this. Acts had been passed, and public analysts had begun testing food samples and nomming offenders in print. But enforcement was patchy at best, penalties were often mild, and a sufficiently clever seller could stay a full step ahead of the inspectors for years at a stretch. The system is catching up slowly. It simply hasn't caught up yet, not at your breakfast table this particular morning. So you eat your pale, padded bread. You drink your tinted tea, brightened with watered, questionable milk. You sweeten it with sanded sugar, and you consider yourself, on the whole, reasonably well fed. The genuinely remarkable thing isn't that people occasionally fell ill from what they ate. It's that they mostly survived it, ate the same food again the next morning, and reserved their complaints almost entirely for the price. And of everything sitting on that table, the single most dangerous item, by some distance, is the one poured so innocently into your teacup. If breakfast has unsettled you slightly, the milk deserves to unsettle you more. In a world without dependable refrigeration, milk traveled slowly, sat for hours in warm conditions, and arrived at your door carrying whatever it happened to have picked up along the way. To stop it turning too quickly, some sellers added preservatives, borax in some cases, formaldehyde in others, a substance more usually associated with preserving the dead than preserving breakfast. For infants and for the poorest households, contaminated milk wasn't a curiosity to laugh about later. It was one of the quiet, persistent killers of the age. Follow the journey a single pint had to make. It began, obviously, inside a cow, and the conditions those cows were kept in, particularly the crowded dairies supplying the bigger cities, weren't conditions anyone today would describe as sanitary. Animals stood packed into dim, poorly ventilated sheds, and the milk was collected into open pails where dust, grime, and worse could settle in freely. From there it traveled by cart, sometimes for hours in the ordinary warmth of the day, before being ladled straight from open churns into whatever jug the customer had brought to the door. At no single point in that chain was there anything resembling a cold enough temperature to slow down what was already happening inside the milk itself. And what was happening was bacteria, thriving in warm, rich liquid left entirely to its own devices. Milk becomes a very comfortable home for all sorts of organisms, some merely unpleasant, some genuinely dangerous. On top of that, cows themselves could carry bovine tuberculosis, and that infection passed directly through the milk to whoever drank it. Pasteurization, the gentle heating process that kills these organisms off, existed as an idea by this point, but was nowhere near universal in practice. A great deal of milk was sold and drunk exactly as it had come out of the animal, untreated. To make matters worse, sellers had every commercial incentive to keep milk looking sellable for as long as possible, since a churn that soured too early meant lost income. So preservatives went in to hold off the spoiling borax, formaldehyde, keeping the milk looking and smelling acceptable well past the point where it genuinely should have been thrown away. There's something quietly unsettling in that idea. The milk that looked freshest on a given morning might well be the milk that had been most heavily tampered with, its natural warning signs chemically silenced before you ever poured it. Add the watering down on top of all that, done to stretch a limited supply further, using water that wasn't itself guaranteed clean, and a single jug could be carrying 3 separate problems layered on top of one another: dilution, contamination, and preservation, all completely invisible to the person carefully pouring it out for their family at breakfast. For most adults, the result was an upset stomach, a bad week, an illness quietly blamed on something else entirely. For infants, who depended on milk almost totally, the story turned far more serious. This is where any humor in the subject has to stop. Contaminated milk was a major contributor to the appallingly high infant mortality of this period, and in the hottest months especially, outbreaks of fatal digestive illness among bobbies tracked the milk supply with grim, predictable reliability. Families did everything right by the standards available to them and still lost children, because the danger was sitting inside the one food they trusted most completely. Reformers understood exactly what was happening, and the long push toward clean, tested, properly pasteurized milk became one of the quieter public health battles of the age, slow, unglamorous, and responsible for saving a great many lives it will never get the credit for. So the next time you glance at a carton stamped with a use-by date and a promise of safety, Know that it represents a genuine, hard-won victory over something that used to kill children by the thousand. You, however, have survived your tea and your milk for one more morning, and now face the next great trial of the day, getting properly, fashionably dressed. Now that you're fed in the loosest possible sense of that word, it's time to get properly dressed, and for a fashionable woman in this era, getting dressed is closer to a small engineering project than an act of putting on clothes. The whole silhouette starts with the corset, and the corset is not there to flatter so much as to negotiate, quite forcefully, with the shape nature originally gave you. Let's be fair to the corset before we get to the horror stories, because it deserves at least a moment of honesty. Nearly every woman of every class wore one, and for most of them, most of the time, it functioned as ordinary underwear, supportive, structured, no more sinister than a stiff collar is to a man's shirt. Worn sensibly, it was uncomfortable the way formal clothing has always been slightly uncomfortable. The trouble comes at the extreme end of the fashion, and the extreme end was very much in vogue this decade. The particular shape in demand right now has a name, the S-bend. The corset is engineered to push the bust forward and the hips back, producing a long, curved, almost swan-like line that looks striking in a photograph and does genuinely strange things to a real spine over time. To complete the effect, the laces are pulled tight at the waist, and for the truly fashion-devoted, pulled tighter still, in a practice known as tight lacing. This is where the body starts to object, quite reasonably. The waist is an empty space waiting to be reshaped. It's full of organs that are, understandably, rather attached to their usual arrangement. Compress that space hard enough for long enough, and those organs get pushed and reshaped along with the fashion. The lower ribs are squeezed inward. The core muscles, no longer required to do much actual work, grow steadily weaker from disuse. What you end up with is a woman who genuinely cannot sit, bend, or breathe the way an uncorseted person can, not from any natural delicacy, but because she has been laced into that delicacy, one tightened lace at a time. This, really, is the honest explanation behind one of the great clichés of the age. The fainting woman reaching dramatically for her smelling salts. It wasn't simply theatrical femininity. When your ribs are compressed and your lungs can't fully expand, it doesn't take much, a warm room, a tight lace pulled that morning, a sudden burst of exertion or strong feeling, before there simply isn't enough breath left to go around. You feel faint because, in a very literal sense, your own outfit has you gently by the middle. The fainting couch sitting in the corner of a fashionable parlor wasn't decorative. It was, quite plainly, safety equipment. Doctors of the period argued about the physical toll constantly. Difficulty breathing, digestive trouble, weakened core strength, general discomfort were all common complaints, and a growing dress reform movement pushed hard for looser, healthier clothing. It made very little headway against the sheer gravitational pull of fashion. Telling a fashionable Edwardian woman that the shape everyone admired was slowly damaging her was rather like telling anyone, in any century, that the thing currently considered beautiful is quietly bad for them. The argument rarely wins. And the corset is only the foundation layer. On top of it goes petticoat after petticoat, a heavy skirt, a fitted bodice, long sleeves, a high collar closing off nearly every inch of visible skin. The whole assembled outfit has real weight to it, and getting properly into it is a lengthy, assisted process. Most women in this position need another pair of hands just to manage the laces running up the back. So you emerge at last, upright, curved into precisely the shape fashion demands, breathing in careful, shallow little sips because that's genuinely all your outfit will allow. You look, by every standard of the day, magnificent. You also, quite urgently, look forward to sitting down. And the moment you step outside for what you might optimistically call fresh air, you'll discover that fresh is not a word that applies to the Edwardian city in any meaningful sense. Step outside and take a breath, and you may well regret it immediately. The Edwardian city runs entirely on coal. Every home, Every factory, every train, every kettle, and all of that burning has to go somewhere. Most days it simply rises and disperses. On the wrong sort of day, cold, still, and damp, it doesn't disperse at all. It sinks back down, mixes with the natural mist rolling off the river, and turns into something considerably worse than ordinary fog. Londoners have taken to calling it a pea souper, which is a rather charming name for something that was slowly, steadily ruining the lungs of everyone forced to breathe it. Ordinary fog is white, or a soft gray. This is neither. A true pea souper carries a thick yellow-brown tint, stained by the soot and sulfur hanging suspended inside it, and it can reduce visibility to only a few feet in front of your own face. People genuinely lose their way within yards of their own front door. Traffic slows to a crawl, or worse, doesn't slow at all, and carriages, carts, and the occasional motor car feel their way blindly through streets that have simply vanished from view. The filth of it is everywhere, and it leaves evidence behind. Soot settles onto every surface, window ledges, the fronts of grand stone buildings blackened over the years, clothing, curtains, skin. Much of the ancient-looking dark stonework we associate with cities from this era wasn't originally that color at all. It started pale and was blackened gradually by the very air surrounding it. A clean white collar put on in the morning can be visibly gray again by the evening. Washing hung out to dry sometimes comes back in dirtier than it went out. The whole city is, in a very real sense, slowly marinating in its own exhaust. The effect on health is severe, entirely predictable, and rarely acted upon with any urgency. Breathing this air day after day inflames the lungs, worsens every existing chest complaint, and feeds directly into the coughs, bronchitis, and chronic respiratory disease that are simply treated as part of ordinary city living. On the very worst days, the death rate among the old, the very young, and the already unwell rises noticeably, though the connection tends to be filed away as unfortunate weather rather than acknowledged as the man-made problem it actually is. The fog is treated rather like rain, something to be endured behind a handkerchief, grumbled about, and then forgotten until next time. There's a certain nostalgia attached to it now, or will be later, the gaslit street half swallowed in mist, atmospheric and moody in 100 future illustrations. It does look dramatic. It is also, in the plainest possible terms, a cloud of genuine poison thick enough to lean against, and the drama comes at the direct cost of the lungs of everyone standing inside it. So you pull your collar up, press a handkerchief to your face, and pick your way along a street you genuinely cannot see the end of, tasting the air as much as breathing it. The real fight for clean air is still decades away. For now, the fog is simply the price paid for a warm home and a working city paid, quite literally, one lungful at a time. And after a day spent breathing all of that in, you might reasonably long for a proper wash. Which brings us, at last, to the weekly bath. Let's talk about staying clean, or at least the very careful appearance of it. For most people in this era, a full bath is a weekly event at best, and a genuinely laborious one, heating water on the kitchen range kettle by kettle, then hauling it across the house into a tin tub set up near the fire, because that's the only room warm enough to survive being undressed in. The first thing to let go of is any modern idea of a bath as quick, private, and available whenever you fancy one. In an Edwardian home, especially a working one, hot water doesn't come out of a tap. It's manufactured by hand, using fuel and time and effort. Water has to be pumped or carried in, poured into pots, set over the range, and left to heat while the fire is fed and watched. Then it has to be carried again to wherever the tub sits, usually the kitchen, sometimes a spot near the hearth in the main room, because nowhere else in the house is warm enough for a person to survive undressed for more than a minute or two. The tub itself is often a portable tin basin, shallow and oval, hung on a nail in the scullery between uses and dragged out for the occasion. Filling it properly takes several trips back and forth, and hot water is always in short supply, so the bath is never deep. Nobody is luxuriating in it. You crouch, you scrub quickly, and you get out again before the heat drains away entirely. Because the water cools fast in a cold house, and the air around the tub is doing its level best to freeze whatever parts of you have just been cleaned. Given the sheer labor involved, the idea of drawing a completely fresh tub for every single member of the household is, for most families, simply out of the question. So the water gets shared, and shared in a fairly strict order. The most senior or most important household members go first, into clean, warm water. Everyone else follows down the ranks, into water growing steadily grayer and cooler with each turn. The youngest child, lowest in the household pecking order, typically goes last, bathing in water that's now thoroughly used and barely warm. It's practical, given the effort behind it, and it is also exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. Between these weekly events, cleanliness gets maintained through the humble daily wash. A basin, a cloth, a bar of soap, and a quick determined scrub of hands, face, and whatever else needs it, usually standing at a cold washstand in an even colder bedroom. Soap itself ranges from harsh, cheap blocks that can strip the skin raw to gentler, more pleasant bars for those who can afford them. This isn't by intention an unwashed society. It's simply one where full immersion is a significant undertaking, not a daily habit. There's also a lingering belief, held by more than a few people, that too much bathing, particularly in cold water, in a cold house, might actually be bad for the health, inviting a chill or weakening the constitution. This is less pure superstition than a fairly reasonable response to lived reality, because bathing in a genuinely freezing house really could leave you shivering and unwell for days afterward. When the bath itself carries some risk, moderation starts to look a lot like common sense. So you have your weekly wash, brisk and shared and never quite as warm as you'd like, and you emerge feeling, if not entirely clean, at least officially cleaner than you were an hour ago. By the standards of the day, that's perfectly respectable. And every single drop of that hard-won hot water, every kettle boiled, every bucket carried up the stairs was somebody's labor. Usually the same somebody who lit your fire this morning, emptied your chamber pot, and has been on her feet since well before you woke. Behind every comfortable Edwardian home stands a small, largely invisible workforce making that comfort look effortless. Domestic service is one of the single largest occupations of the entire era, employing enormous numbers of people, overwhelmingly women, and a great many of them barely more than girls. A daughter might enter service at 13 or 14, leaving her own family behind to live inside a stranger's house, and learn an entire unwritten code built on bells, hierarchy, and one central, unspoken rule. The family must never actually see how the comfort gets produced. The working day begins in the dark, long before anyone upstairs has stirred. The lowest-ranking servants are already awake, raking cold ash from last night's grates, laying and lighting new fires, polishing the iron surrounds until they gleam, hauling coal up flight after flight of stairs, heating water that will let the household above wake into warmth without ever having to think about where that warmth came from. All of it has to be finished and tidied away before anyone important appears, so the family experiences only the pleasant result, never the cold, grubby labor that produced it. From there, the day unfolds into an almost endless list: scrubbing, polishing, cooking, carrying, serving, clearing, laundering, and then cleaning again, in a house that manages to generate an astonishing volume of work precisely because it's full of delicate, decorative, difficult-to-clean things. Every fire lit means ash to clear. Every meal served means dishes to wash. Every fashionable outfit worn means laundry, and laundry alone, with its boiling, scrubbing, wringing, and pressing, can consume an entire day by itself. Running through all of it is the summoning system of bells, by which any family member can, at any moment, ring for attention and expect it delivered promptly, whatever task was interrupted to provide it. Working hours stretch from well before dawn until the family has finally retired for the night, with only scraps of personal time in between, and if a servant is fortunate, a single half-day off somewhere in the week. Living quarters tend to be the coldest, plainest rooms in the entire building, an airless attic in summer, a freezing one in winter, or a cramped basement room near the kitchen. Privacy is minimal. Wages are small, though the arrangement does come with food and a bed, which for many is precisely the point, more security than most alternatives on offer. There are rules for almost everything, including how to behave in the family's presence, when to speak, when to stay silent, how to make yourself scarce at exactly the right moment. In some of the grander households, servants are expected to turn and face the wall if a family member passes in a corridor, preserving the polite fiction that the people doing all the actual work aren't quite fully there. It's a strange, exhausting performance of invisibility, layered directly on top of genuinely grueling physical labor. It would be easy to romanticize all of this: the gleaming grates, the perfectly served dinner, the orderly, well-run household, and there was, within it, real pride and skill, sometimes even real affection between families and the people who served them. But it was built on the early mornings and aching backs of people who kept an entire comfortable world turning from the shadows, thanked mostly by simply not being noticed at all. So spare a thought for that invisible workforce as the day rolls on, because for one particular corner of Edwardian life, a corner touching the most vulnerable people of all, that same culture of not looking too closely hid something far darker than hard labor. Some corners of Edwardian life aren't amusing at all, and this is one of them. For unmarried mothers and families with no other options, there existed a grim, quiet arrangement known as baby farming, infants handed over along with a fee to be raised by strangers. Some of the women who took these children in were genuinely kind and did their honest best. Others simply took the payment and provided as little as they could get away with. The outcomes for the children caught on the wrong side of that gamble could be tragic. To understand how this became so widespread, you first have to understand the trap that created it. An unmarried woman who found herself pregnant in this era faced something close to social ruin. There was no meaningful support system, little sympathy, and often no way whatsoever to keep both her child and her livelihood. Respectable employment, domestic service most of all, could vanish the instant her situation became known. She was expected to feel ashamed, to hide, and to somehow make the entire problem disappear. Society had built the wall around her, and then blamed her for being trapped behind it. Into that impossible situation stepped the baby farmer. In exchange for a payment, sometimes weekly, sometimes a single lump sum, a woman would agree to take in an infant and raise it, or arrange for it to be fostered or adopted elsewhere. For a mother with nowhere else to turn, this could feel like the only door still open. She could return to work, keep her secret, and tell herself the child was safe and cared for. Many desperately wanted to believe exactly that, and some carers genuinely were decent, capable people doing their honest best. But the system carried an obvious, built-in flaw. A single lump payment handed over once, with no ongoing oversight and nobody checking in afterward, created a grim incentive. The money was the same whether the child thrived for years or didn't survive the month. Where a carer turned out to be neglectful, or worse, there was very little to stop them, because the entire arrangement depended on secrecy, and the same shame that drove mothers to hand over their babies also ensured nobody came looking to check on them afterward. In the worst cases, the results were the deaths of infants through neglect, inadequate feeding, illness left untreated in overcrowded, unsuitable homes. This wasn't some rare crime committed by an isolated monster. It was the predictable outcome of a system combining desperate mothers, unregulated carers, a financial incentive built the wrong way round, and a society that preferred not to look too closely at what happened to children it had already decided were an embarrassment. Reformers and campaigners did push back against it. Laws began requiring the registration and inspection of homes taking in infants for payment, and legislation aimed at protecting infant life tried to bring these arrangements into the light and hold carers properly accountable. But enforcement was difficult. The practice remained widespread. And the deeper problem, the complete absence of support for unmarried mothers, stayed firmly in place underneath it all. You cannot regulate away a tragedy while leaving every condition that produces it fully intact. It matters to name this plainly rather than soften it into a curiosity. Real children died. Real mothers made agonizing choices under impossible pressure, choices many of them carried in silence for the rest of their lives. The elegance of this age, its manners and its confident sense of its own respectability, sat directly on top of stories like this one, and the two things were never really separate. A society that prized appearances above almost everything else had made it safer, in practical terms, to hide a child away than to acknowledge one. It's a heavy place to pause, and it should be. From here, the day moves on to another group whose hardship was treated as simply ordinary, the children who didn't disappear but who worked. By this point in the era, children are no longer being sent up chimneys, and that matters. Real progress had been made, and it deserves proper acknowledgement. A series of laws had raised the minimum working age, limited hours, and required at least some schooling for working-class children. The image of the small chimney sweep or the child dragged underground into a coal seam belongs increasingly to an earlier chapter of the century. Compulsory schooling meant most children now spent at least part of their early years learning to read and write rather than laboring the full day. But improvement isn't the same thing as an ending. For working-class families, a child's earnings were very often not a small luxury but a genuine necessity, one more modest income helping keep the household fed. Out of that need grew a compromise known as the half-time system, in which older children split their day between the schoolroom and the factory floor. A child might sit through lessons in the morning and stand at a machine all afternoon, or alternate entire days between desk and workroom. On paper, this looked like balance. In practice, it meant children carrying the exhaustion of adult labor straight into the classroom, and the demands of the classroom straight into the workplace. The work itself was rarely gentle. Textile mills in particular employed large numbers of children, and the tasks handed to them often placed small bodies close to fast-moving, largely unguarded machinery. Small hands were valued precisely because they could reach into tight spaces adult hands couldn't, retrieving broken threads, clearing jammed parts, cleaning sections of a machine while it was still, in some cases, running. The accidents that followed, crushed fingers and worse, were a known, quietly accepted hazard of the trade. The rooms themselves tended to be hot, deafeningly loud, and thick with dust that did young lungs no favors at all. Beyond the factory floor, children worked in countless other, less visible ways, running errands, selling small goods on the street corner, minding younger siblings all day, helping out in a family trade, fetching and carrying and laboring inside the informal economy that kept poorer households afloat. A great deal of this labor never showed up in any official record at all. It simply folded quietly into the ordinary daily struggle of a family getting by. For these children, the day wasn't neatly divided into school and work. It was simply full, from early morning until whenever the last task was finally done. None of this registered as scandalous to most people at the time. It was regarded as normal, even natural, the expected lot of a poor child. The notion that childhood itself ought to be a protected, playful time for everyone, regardless of class, was still very much taking shape, argued for passionately by reformers and resisted just as firmly by those who relied on that cheap labor, or who simply saw no realistic alternative to it. So when we picture this era, it's worth holding both images together at once. The child bent over a school desk, a genuine sign of real progress, and that same child standing at a machine a few hours later, a sign of exactly how far there still was left to go. Often, They were the very same child, and the day, for both versions of them, was very long indeed. And for some workers, young and old alike, the danger wasn't the machine at all. It was the material sitting right there in their bare hands. Consider the humble match, and the people who actually made it. In match factories scattered across the country, workers, a great many of them young women, handled white phosphorus for long shifts inside poorly ventilated rooms. Over time, the fumes could attack the jawbone itself, producing a disfiguring, agonizing condition the workers themselves grimly nicknamed Phossy Jaw. The danger had been understood for years before the substance was finally banned outright, which tells you a good deal about whose comfort mattered in this period and whose plainly didn't. A match seems like the most innocent object imaginable, a small stick, a bright striking head, a moment of useful flame. Every home in the country needed vast quantities of them, for fires, lamps, stoves, candles. That relentless demand meant matches had to be produced on an enormous scale, and the cheapest, most common manufacturing process depended on white phosphorus, the very substance that let a match strike so easily and so reliably. The people doing this work were mostly women and girls, often quite young, employed in the crowded match factories of the larger cities. Their days were long, their pay low, and the conditions were precisely the sort that turn a hazardous material into a genuinely dangerous one. The rooms were often badly ventilated, meaning the fumes given off by the phosphorus simply hung in the air the workers breathed, hour after hour, shift after shift. The material settled onto their hands, their clothes, sometimes even their food. In an environment like that, prolonged exposure wasn't a risk, it was close to a certainty. The resulting condition was as cruel as anything the industrial age produced. Absorbed over time, white phosphorus could attack the bones of the face, the jaw in particular. It often began quietly, with toothache and swelling easily mistaken for an ordinary dental complaint. But it could progress into something far worse, the slow decay of the jawbone itself, bringing intense pain, visible disfigurement, abscesses, and an unmistakable, foul symptom of the disease. In advanced cases, the damage was devastating, and treatment could mean surgically removing part of the jaw. Some sufferers didn't survive the infections that followed. What makes this genuinely difficult to sit with is that the danger was never a mystery to the people running these factories. The link between white phosphorus and this terrible condition had been recognized for a long time before any meaningful action followed. Safer alternatives existed. A different form of phosphorus could produce matches without carrying the same risk, and some manufacturers had already switched over, proving conclusively that a match could be made without maiming the person who made it. The real obstacle was cost and habit, not any lack of knowledge. So for years, the disease continued, and the workers bore the cost of it, because the cheaper, more dangerous method remained perfectly legal and perfectly profitable. Campaigners, journalists, and reformers kept drawing attention to the suffering, and pressure gradually built. Eventually, the use of white phosphorus in matches was prohibited. An international agreement was reached to abolish it, and countries passed laws to enforce the ban, bringing this particular horror at last toward its end. It was a real victory, but a slow one, arriving long after the harm had already been thoroughly understood. There's a hard lesson tucked into this small stick of wood. A society can know full well that something is hurting people, can even possess a safer alternative sitting right there, and still allow the harm to continue for years, simply because stopping it would cost money and disrupt a comfortable arrangement. The matchworkers paid the price of that delay with their health, and in some cases with their lives. So the next time a match strikes and flares without a second thought, it's worth remembering that this small, ordinary convenience once carried a genuinely hidden human cost. There's a reason the phrase "mad as a hatter" made its way into the language, and it isn't a cheerful one. Producing the finest fashionable felt hats of this era involved treating animal fur with mercury compounds, and the workers who carried out that process breathed in the fumes, day after day, year after year. Over time, mercury attacks the nervous system, producing tremors, confusion, and slurred speech. The hats themselves looked wonderful. The people who made them paid a price nobody ever thought to print on the label. A hat in this era is not an optional accessory. A respectable person simply does not leave the house bareheaded, and the resulting industry, covering every level of quality, style, and price, is a serious one. The finest hats are made of felt, and the best felt comes from fur, particularly rabbit fur, transformed through a process that turns soft animal hair into a dense, durable, moldable material. That transformation is where the real trouble begins. To make the fur mat together properly into usable felt, workers treat it with a solution containing mercury, in a process sometimes called carroting, named for the distinctive orange color it leaves on the fur. The process genuinely works. It produces superior felt, which is exactly why it's used so widely, but it means the fur, and the workshop air around it, becomes saturated with mercury. As the treated fur is steamed, shaped, and worked by hand, mercury vapor rises steadily into the air, and the workers bent over their benches in warm, enclosed rooms breathe it in continuously, shift after shift. Mercury has a particular cruel fondness for the nervous system, and its effects on hatters build slowly and relentlessly across years of exposure. Tremors develop first, a trembling in the hands and body that can grow severe enough to interfere with the very fine handwork the trade demands. Changes in mood and personality often follow. Irritability, anxiety, a kind of withdrawal from other people. Speech can slur. Memory grows unreliable. Coordination suffers. To an outside observer, a hatter well advanced in the trade might genuinely appear confused, shaky, and strange. And the reputation stuck so firmly to the profession that it became a common expression, repeated by people with no idea where it came from. That's the genuinely uncomfortable part of the story. The wider world didn't respond to visibly poisoned workers with alarm or reform. It responded by turning their suffering into a figure of fun, a colorful saying, a stock character of harmless eccentricity. The real cause of their decline was absorbed into casual language and largely forgotten by the people repeating it. As with so many hazards of this age, the danger here was understood by those willing to look closely. Safer processes and materials existed, but the mercury method produced good felt cheaply. The industry around it was already well established, and change, as it so often does, dragged along well behind the knowledge that should have prompted it sooner. For a long time, the hats kept coming, and so did the tremors. There's a grim kind of symmetry in it. The very item meant to signal respectability and social standing, a well-made hat, worn confidently on a fashionable head, was produced by workers whose health was being quietly, steadily destroyed in the making of it. The wearer tips his hat politely to a passing acquaintance on the street, entirely unaware of the toll behind its manufacture. If you fall genuinely ill in this era, the treatments on offer range from useless to actively hazardous, and this is the great age of the tonic, the miracle cure, the bottle of tinted, flavored water promising to fix everything from baldness to consumption. Some of these bottles contain alcohol, some contain opiates. And as the years roll on, some proudly advertise the newly fashionable wonder of radium, at a time when radioactivity is still considered a marker of vigor and health, rather than the danger we now understand it to be. Let's be fair to legitimate Edwardian medicine before we mock the fringes of it, because real doctors are doing genuinely serious, improving work in this period. Surgery is advancing quickly. Anesthesia has transformed what's possible in the operating theater, and a growing understanding of germs is quietly revolutionizing both hygiene and public health more broadly. If you have access to a good doctor and a treatable condition, you're in far better hands than your grandparents would have been. The real problem sits just outside the reputable surgery, in the vast, largely unregulated world of the patent medicine. These are miracle cures sold directly to the public, in a bottle carrying a confident label and an equally confident list of complaints it claims to cure. And what a list it often is. A single tonic might promise relief from exhaustion, indigestion, nervousness, thin blood, poor complexion, hair loss, and half a dozen other ailments, often finishing with a vague, thrilling suggestion that it also strengthens the entire system. These claims are, to put it gently, ambitious. The medicine inside rarely does any of what's advertised, and whatever real effect it produces comes entirely from whatever it actually contains. Frequently, what it actually contains is alcohol, and a fair quantity of it. Plenty of thoroughly respectable people who would never dream of stepping into a public house dose themselves several times a day with a health tonic. That is, in practical terms, a strong spirit with some flavoring added. They feel warmed, relaxed, cheerful, and mistake that feeling for a genuine return to health, then reach for the bottle again the following morning. Others, as we've already seen, lean on opiates instead, producing a pleasant sense of relief that has nothing whatsoever to do with fixing the underlying problem, and everything to do with quietly dulling it. And then, as the science of the new century marches forward, comes radium. The discovery of radioactivity is one of the great scientific sensations of the age, mysterious, glamorous, thrillingly modern, and the makers of tonics and cures cannot resist it for a moment. Poorly understood by the general public, radioactivity gets marketed as a source of vitality and energy, and products soon begin boasting of their radioactive content as a genuine selling point, promising to invigorate the body with this exciting new force. The idea that the same force might cause serious harm hasn't entered popular understanding yet, so people happily go looking for radioactivity as a health benefit, exactly backwards from what we now know to be true. The entire patent medicine trade rests on one simple, powerful thing: hope. People who are ill, frightened, or simply tired want desperately to believe that relief can be bought in a bottle for a modest price, sparing them both the expense and the grim news a proper doctor might deliver. The sellers understand this completely and sell hope by the crate. Some customers are merely cheated of their money. Others are genuinely harmed by what's inside the bottle, or lose precious time treating a serious illness with flavored, tinted water while the real problem quietly worsens underneath. Proper regulation, testing, and honest labeling will eventually reign in the worst excesses of all this, but slowly, and against considerable commercial resistance. And if your particular complaint happens to be a bad tooth, you're about to face a rather different ordeal entirely, one no tonic on the shelf can help you with. Open wide if you dare. Edwardian dentistry exists, and in some places it's genuinely skilled, but pain-killing relief is far from guaranteed. And for most ordinary people, the standard answer to a troublesome tooth is simply extraction, endured with whatever dignity can be managed on the day. Those who lose enough teeth eventually graduate to dentures, and for the fashionable, the fearful, or simply the wealthy, some choose to have perfectly healthy teeth removed while still young, purely to spare themselves the trouble in later life. Dental care in this period is a genuine study in extremes. At the top end in the cities, there are skilled, increasingly professional dentists doing excellent work with the newest available techniques and emerging anesthetics. At the bottom end, where most ordinary people find themselves, there's pain, delay, and eventual removal. Which experience you get depends almost entirely on how much money you have and where you happen to live. The root of the whole problem, so to speak, is that prevention barely exists for most people. Regular brushing isn't yet a widespread habit. A visit to the dentist tends to happen only once the pain has become unbearable, rather than as any kind of routine maintenance. And a diet increasingly rich in cheap sugar is quietly working against the nation's teeth in the background. A toothache is therefore a common, dreaded event, and by the time it becomes genuinely unbearable, the tooth in question is very often already beyond saving. That leaves one reliable remedy: pull it out. Extraction is the workhorse of ordinary dentistry, and for a great deal of the population, It's carried out with little or no pain relief at all. Anesthetics do exist and are spreading, both the gas that can send a patient briefly under, and local numbing agents that can deaden a specific area, and a well-equipped dentist may well use them. But access is uneven, and plenty of extractions, especially the cheaper ones available to ordinary people, are still endured fully awake, gripping the arms of the chair and simply hopping it over quickly. It's brief, brutal, and thoroughly memorable, exactly the sort of experience that earned the dentist's chair its fearsome reputation. Lose enough teeth, and you enter the world of dentures. False teeth are common and much sought after, restoring both the ability to eat properly and the appearance of a full smile. Manufacturing has improved considerably compared to earlier decades, and reasonably hygienic false teeth are now available to anyone who can afford them. Still, a full set is a significant purchase and a significant adjustment, and a great many people simply live with the gaps instead. The most striking custom of all, at least to modern ears, is the deliberate removal of perfectly healthy teeth. Because dental trouble is seen as such an inevitable misery of later life, some people choose to have every tooth extracted while still young, fitted afterward with a complete set of dentures, reasoning that it's better to endure the pain and expense all at once than to face a lifetime of aching, decaying teeth one at a time. In certain circles, a full set of dentures is even given as a practical wedding gift, a strange sort of investment in a future free of dental pain. Sacrificing a perfectly healthy smile to avoid future dentistry tells you a good deal about just how deeply that future dentistry is feared. So you leave the dentist's chair lighter by a tooth or two, jaw aching, dignity slightly bruised, and quietly grateful it's over for now. By the standards of the day, this is perfectly ordinary, and whatever discomfort the tooth brought, it's nothing beside the danger faced daily by the men whose labor, far underground, keeps every fire in the country burning in the first place. Far from the tea rooms and drawing rooms of the fashionable world, this entire era runs on coal, and coal has to be cut from the earth by hand. Miners spend their days deep underground, in heat, in dust, breathing air that slowly wears away at their lungs, working always under the constant possibility of collapse, flood, or explosion. It's brutal, dangerous, essential work, and the comfortable warmth glowing in every fashionable parlor above ground has been quietly bought with it. Everything in this era depends on coal. It heats the homes, boils the kettles, drives the trains, powers the factories, fuels the ships and industries that have made the country wealthy. That enormous appetite has to be fed, and it's fed by men and boys descending into the earth every single day to cut coal loose from the seam and haul it back up to the surface. The nation's comfort has a foundation, and that foundation is a workforce laboring in some of the most punishing conditions imaginable. Begin with the descent itself. A miner goes down into total darkness, sometimes very deep indeed, into a world with no daylight at all, lit only by the lamp he carries. The further the workings stretch outward, the further he has to travel underground just to reach the coal face where the actual cutting begins. Down there the air runs hot, the space is often cramped, and in the narrowest, lowest seams, men work bent double, kneeling or lying on their sides, swinging heavy tools in positions no human body was ever built to hold for hour after hour. The dangers come in several distinct forms, and all of them are constant. There's the ever-present threat of the roof giving way, burying men beneath rock and earth. There's flooding, water breaking suddenly into the workings and trapping or drowning those below. And most feared of all, there's gas, the invisible menace of the mine. Pockets of flammable gas can ignite from a single spark or open flame, tearing through the tunnels in an instant, while other gases can suffocate a man before he even understands he's in danger. A single ignition can kill many men at once, and mining disasters claiming dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives are a recurring, grimly familiar feature of the age, mourned deeply in the mining communities. And then, too often, followed by a return to the very same work under the very same risks. Even for those who avoid sudden catastrophe entirely, the work exacts a slower toll. The air underground stays thick with coal dust, and breathing it in year after year coats and damages the lungs, feeding directly into the chronic, disabling respiratory disease that shortens so many miners' lives. The body wears down under the labor, the awkward posture, the cold and damp, and the sheer relentlessness of the schedule. A miner's working life is hard, and it very often ends early. Boys enter this world young, starting out with simpler tasks near the surface and working their way gradually toward the coal face as they grow, so that mining is frequently a life begun in childhood and carried on until the body simply can't do it any longer. Whole communities are built around the pits, their fortunes rising and falling with the mine's fortunes, their lives shaped by its rhythms and shadowed constantly by its dangers. When the pit does well, the village works. When disaster strikes, the whole community grieves together as one. Improvements are coming in safety practice, in ventilation, in inspection and regulation, usually won through hard struggle and the bitter lessons of disaster after disaster. But the fundamental danger of the work itself never really disappears, and the men go down regardless, because the coal is needed and the wages feed their families. So as the fashionable household above warms itself comfortably by a glowing fire this evening, it's worth remembering exactly where that warmth was born, and at what cost, in the darkness beneath everyone's feet. For the very poorest, one institution looms over every hard winter and every lost job: the workhouse. It offers food and shelter of the grimmest possible kind, and in exchange, it takes nearly everything else, including a person's basic dignity. Families are often separated the moment they arrive, set to tedious, repetitive labor, and reminded at every turn that poverty is to be treated as a personal failing rather than a misfortune. The fear of ending up inside its walls shapes the lives of millions who never actually cross its threshold. The workhouse is the very last resort of the destitute, the place you go when every other option has already failed. Lose your job, fall too ill to work, grow too old to earn a wage, or find yourself suddenly alone with children and no means to feed them. And if family or charity can't save you, the workhouse is what remains. It offers relief, certainly, but it's designed from the ground up to make that relief as harsh and unappealing as possible, and this harshness is entirely deliberate. It is, in fact, the whole point. The thinking behind it is cold and quite calculated. The authorities fear that if relief is made too comfortable, the poor will simply choose it over working at all. So the workhouse is built to be deliberately unpleasant, less appealing than even the hardest, worst-paid labor available outside its walls. The goal is to ensure only the truly desperate ever choose to enter, treating poverty itself as a condition to be actively discouraged rather than a misfortune to be gently eased. Being poor is, under this logic, treated almost as a moral failing, and the workhouse is built specifically to make you feel exactly that. Entering means surrendering your freedom and a great deal of your identity along with it. On arrival, families are commonly split apart. Husbands, wives, and children divided into entirely separate sections of the building, sometimes seeing very little of one another for the whole of their stay. So that a family seeking shelter together ends up pulled apart at the very door. Uniforms are issued. Routines are rigid, governed by bells and by the authority of the staff running the place. Whatever meager comfort the outside world offered is replaced here by an institutional order that leaves almost no room for individual dignity at all. Inmates are set to work, since the workhouse is meant to extract labor in exchange for its keep. The tasks handed out are often deliberately monotonous and physically wearing, chosen more for their punishing tedium than for any real usefulness, the sort of grinding, repetitive work designed to occupy and to humble in equal measure. Food is plain and just barely sufficient. Shelter is basic. The whole experience is engineered to be endured, not lived through comfortably. Within these walls live a mixture of society's most vulnerable people: the elderly with nobody left to support them, the sick and the disabled, orphaned and abandoned children, unmarried mothers, and those simply broken by bad luck and hard times. People who, under a kinder system, would have been cared for gently instead find themselves lumped together under a regime that treats need itself as something shameful. The old who worked hard their entire lives can end their final days here, a bitter reward by any measure for a lifetime of honest labor. It's little wonder the workhouse casts such a long shadow. Even those who never enter it live in fear of the possibility, and that fear shapes their choices, pushing people to keep working while genuinely sick, to cling desperately to any job at all, to hide their hardships from neighbors, and to dread old age itself. The thread of the workhouse operates as a quiet disciplining force running through the whole of working-class life, a constant, unspoken warning of exactly where you might end up if you falter even once. Reform will eventually soften and later dismantle this entire system, replacing it over time with more humane forms of support. But for the Edwardian poor living through this particular decade, the workhouse remains a very present, very real possibility. Running quietly through every level of society, rich and poor alike, is a disease so common it has become almost a fixture of ordinary life. Tuberculosis, known more often by its older name, consumption. It moves slowly through crowded homes and workplaces, claiming an extraordinary number of people from every class imaginable. Its pale, wasting appearance is even romanticized, oddly enough, in art and fashion, a strange thing to do with a disease of the lungs, but the Edwardians manage it, all while the illness steadily takes lives around them, year after year. Tuberculosis isn't some rare, exotic threat lurking at the edges of society. It's everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that's genuinely hard to imagine now. It stands as one of the great killers of the age, striking down people in the very prime of life just as readily as the very young or the very old, touching families at every level of society without much regard for wealth or standing. Almost everyone knows someone who's been taken by it. It's less an occasional tragedy than a near-permanent feature of the world people live in. The disease attacks the lungs most often, though it can spread to other parts of the body, and it tends to progress slowly, over months or sometimes years. Its course is marked by a persistent cough, steady weight loss, weakness, fever, and a gradual wasting away that gave the illness its older name, because the sufferer does genuinely seem to be slowly consumed from the inside. It's a long, draining, frequently fatal illness, and in an age before antibiotics, there's no reliable cure waiting at the end of it. It spreads most easily in exactly the conditions so many people already live in: crowded housing, shared and poorly ventilated rooms, the close quarters of workplaces and institutions alike. The poor, packed into cramped, unhealthy dwellings, are especially vulnerable to it. But the disease shows no particular respect for wealth either, reaching into comfortable homes just as readily as into the poorest slums. Damp, overcrowding, and stale air all give it every advantage it needs, and the Edwardian city offers all three in generous supply. Treatment reflects both genuine effort and real hard limitation. The favored approach leans on rest, good food, and above all, fresh air, which has given rise to the sanatorium, an institution where sufferers, particularly those who can afford it, go to recover in clean air, often out in the countryside or up in the mountains. Patients rest for long stretches, eat carefully, and spend hours simply breathing air thought to have healing properties. For some, this genuinely helps, strengthening the body enough to fight the disease off. It's no guaranteed cure, though, and plenty of patients don't recover regardless of how carefully they follow the regimen. Strangest of all to modern sensibilities is the way the illness seeps into ideas of beauty itself. The wasting effect of consumption, the pale skin, the thinness, the fragile, delicate appearance becomes tangled up with romantic ideals of sensitivity, particularly where women are concerned. A pale complexion and a certain fragile slenderness are admired, and in some circles the look associated with the illness becomes, quietly, almost fashionable. There's something deeply unsettling in a culture that half admires the appearance of a disease actively killing its own people. But the admiration is entirely real, however uncomfortable it sits with us now. The true defeat of tuberculosis lies well in the future, in better living conditions, in vaccination, and eventually in the antibiotics that will finally give doctors a real advantage against it. For the Edwardians living through this decade, it remains a familiar, formidable enemy, endured, feared, and thoroughly woven into daily life. And when it, or any of the era's countless other dangers, finally claims a life, the household meets that death with an elaborate, highly particular ceremony all its own. When death comes, and in this era it comes often, the household meets it with an elaborate etiquette inherited almost wholesale from the Victorians before them. There are strict rules for mourning dress, rules for exactly how long grief should be observed, and an entire small industry built around doing death properly. Families sometimes commission photographs of the deceased, carefully posed as though merely sleeping, kept afterward as a final, treasured memory. To modern eyes it can look unsettling. To them it's simply the correct, respectful way to say goodbye. Death is a far more visible, far more frequent presence in Edwardian life than it is for most people today. With high infant mortality, common infectious disease, dangerous working conditions, and no antibiotics to fall back on, families lose members of every age with a regularity that makes death feel like a familiar companion rather than some distant, abstract event. People generally die at home, surrounded by family, and the body remains in the house until burial. Death isn't hidden away in some distant institution. It happens in the front bedroom, and everyone, including the children of the house, grows up in close proximity to it. Because death is so present, an elaborate culture has grown up around responding to it correctly, and this generation has inherited a detailed, demanding code of mourning from the Victorian era before them. There are rules, and respectable people follow them closely. Mourning gets expressed primarily through dress, and the clothing worn tells everyone at a glance exactly where a person stands in their grief. Deep mourning for a husband, especially, means dressing entirely in black, in particular heavy fabrics, for an extended stretch of time. As the months pass, one moves gradually into lighter stages of mourning, permitting small relaxations, a touch of gray or purple, before eventually returning to ordinary dress. The length and depth of mourning depends entirely on your relationship to the person who died, and getting it wrong, mourning too little, or for too short a time, risks looking cold and improper in front of the whole neighborhood. This has, naturally, created an entire industry around it. There are shops devoted purely to mourning clothes and accessories, ready to outfit a grieving family correctly and quickly. There's elaborate funeral provision too, from the plumed horses and grand hearses of a wealthy send-off down to the far more modest arrangements ordinary families scrimp and save toward, determined to give their dead a decent, respectable burial. To be buried poorly, or worse, to end up in a pauper's grave, is considered a deep and lasting shame, and many people pay faithfully into small burial funds their entire lives, purely to avoid that fate. Doing death properly matters enormously, sometimes rather more than a family can genuinely afford. Among the customs that most startle modern observers is the practice of photographing the dead. Photography is still relatively new and precious in this period, and for many families, a photograph of a loved one is a rare, treasured possession. When someone dies, a child especially, if no photograph exists from life, families sometimes commission a formal portrait afterward. The body is carefully arranged and dressed, sometimes posed to look peacefully asleep, sometimes seated among living family members and photographed together, to create one lasting image of everyone the family loves. To us now, this can look eerie, even disturbing. But in its own time, it's an act of love and remembrance, a way of holding onto the face of someone dear when no other image exists at all. There's a genuine sincerity running through all of it. These customs aren't empty theater. They give shape and meaning to grief, offer a clear way to honor the dead and signal loss to the wider world, and provide real comfort through ritual in the face of something overwhelming. The rules can be rigid, and the expense a real burden, but the impulse underneath is deeply human, the wish to say goodbye properly and to remember well. So the household mourns thoroughly, dresses in black, keeps its photographs, and in time returns to the business of living. And for a great many people, living means returning to work in conditions that can be every bit as hazardous as anything else this era has shown us. Mental illness in this era is handled with a peculiar mixture of good intentions and genuine cruelty, usually well out of sight, behind the high walls of the asylum. People can be committed for reasons ranging from real, severe distress all the way down to simple inconvenience. And once inside, treatment often has far more to do with containment than with any real attempt at healing. Understanding of the mind is still in its infancy, and those who suffer are frequently hidden away rather than genuinely helped, out of view of a society that would generally rather not look too closely. The asylum is this era's great answer to mental suffering, and it is, at least on paper, meant as an improvement on what came before. The large institutions built across the country are intended as places of care and order, a real step up from the cruder confinements of earlier generations. Some of the people running them hold genuinely sincere reforming ideals, but the reality that's actually developed inside those walls falls well short of the hopeful blueprint that inspired them. Part of the trouble lies in how easily a person can be sent there in the first place. The grounds for committal are broad and poorly defined, and the entire process hands enormous power to families and doctors alike. Genuinely severe mental illness is, of course, among the reasons people are admitted, but so are a whole range of milder conditions and behaviors that have very little to do with madness as we'd understand it today. People can find themselves confined for melancholy, for what's vaguely termed nervous collapse, or simply for conduct that embarrasses or inconveniences the people around them. Women, in particular, are vulnerable to being committed for behavior that defies the narrow expectations placed on them, and the line between someone who genuinely needs care and someone who's merely considered difficult or unwanted can be disturbingly thin. Once admitted, a patient enters a world governed by routine, discipline, and confinement. The sheer scale of these institutions, holding vast numbers of people at once, means individual attention is scarce, and managing the crowd tends to take priority over anything else. Treatment, such as it is, leans heavily on order and control, keeping patients occupied, restrained, and quiet, rather than on any genuine understanding of what's actually troubling them. Real therapeutic knowledge barely exists yet. The mind remains a mystery, its illnesses poorly understood, and the tools available are crude at best. That phrase, out of sight, sits at the center of the whole story. For a society deeply concerned with appearances and respectability, mental illness is often treated as an embarrassment, a stain on a family's standing, something to be concealed rather than addressed. The asylum offers a solution that's as much social as it is medical. It removes the troubled person entirely from view, sparing the family both the shame and the burden, placing them somewhere the wider world need not think about them at all. Once inside, a patient can remain for years, sometimes for the rest of their life, gradually forgotten by everyone beyond the walls. There's real cruelty here, though often not the deliberate, cackling cruelty of a storybook villain. It's the quieter cruelty of neglect, of misunderstanding, of a system that confines people it genuinely doesn't know how to help, and then largely stops trying. There are kind attendants inside these places, and well-meaning doctors too. But the structure itself, vast, under-resourced, built on ignorance, simply cannot deliver the care it originally promised. Understanding of the mind will advance enormously across the century to come. But for now, the asylum on the hill remains the standard answer, and for many who enter it, a permanent one. Time perhaps for a relaxing cigarette, because in this era it feels as though absolutely everyone is having one. Smoking is thoroughly woven into daily life, considered sophisticated, soothing, and entirely harmless. The advertisements are cheerful. The doctors see no particular problem with it. Pipes, cigars, and cigarettes fill homes, offices, and railway carriages alike with a more or less permanent haze. And the idea that any of it might eventually turn out to be dangerous is still many decades away from being taken seriously by anyone at all. To picture this world accurately, you have to imagine nearly every indoor scene wrapped in a faint blue haze of tobacco smoke. People smoke in their own homes, in their workplaces, in restaurants, pubs, and gentlemen's clubs, on trains and omnibuses, out in the open street. Grand houses and hotels keep dedicated smoking rooms, quiet spaces where gentlemen retire after dinner to enjoy a pipe or cigar in comfort. Smoking isn't a guilty habit tucked away out of shame here. It's a public pleasure, a mark of relaxation and good living, close to universal among men and increasingly taken up by women too. The forms it takes carry their own social meaning. The pipe belongs to the settled, comfortable man. The cigar marks prosperity and celebration, passed around after a good dinner as a small ceremony of success. The cigarette, meanwhile, is rising fast, convenient, cheap, modern, and looks set to dominate as the new century wears on. Each carries its own signal, and choosing your tobacco carefully is very much part of presenting yourself correctly to the world. Crucially, all of this is regarded as entirely harmless, even beneficial. Tobacco is widely believed to soothe the nerves, aid concentration, help a person relax after a long day, and there's no popular understanding whatsoever yet of the serious dangers we now associate with it. The idea that smoking might cause deadly disease, damage the lungs and heart, and shorten a life considerably simply isn't part of the conversation. Doctors don't warn against it the way they later will. Advertisements present it as pleasant, wholesome, thoroughly stylish, and there's nothing around to contradict them. A person lighting up feels they're doing something entirely ordinary and rather agreeable, because, as far as anyone currently knows, they are. The consequences, of course, are unfolding invisibly, in the form of illness that won't be clearly connected back to its cause for many decades yet. The great scientific reckoning that eventually reveals the true toll of tobacco lies far in the future. For now, this generation smokes freely, generously, and without the faintest twinge of concern, filling their own lungs and their own rooms with something they have every reason to believe is entirely benign. Step out into the street, and it's worth watching carefully where you tread, because the Edwardian city still runs in large part on horses, and horses, in enormous numbers, produce exactly what you'd expect. Thousands of them haul carriages, cabs, and carts through the streets every single day, leaving behind tons of waste, along with the flies, the persistent smell, and the disease that inevitably follows. The motor car has only just begun to appear, promising a cleaner future, while introducing, in the same breath, the exciting new possibility of being struck down by something considerably faster than a trotting horse. Before the age of the motor car truly arrives, the horse is the working engine of the whole city, and there are an astonishing number of them at work. Horses pull the cabs and private carriages carrying people about, the carts and wagons hauling goods, the crowded omnibuses moving whole streets of passengers, the delivery vehicles keeping every shop and household properly supplied. A functioning city depends on tens of thousands of working horses, and every single one of them eats, and therefore every single one produces waste in genuinely staggering, unrelenting quantities. The result is a sanitation problem of real scale. Streets accumulate manure daily, along with urine soaking into the road surface, and occasionally the carcasses of horses that simply drop dead in harness, sometimes left where they fell until removal can be arranged. In dry weather, The manure dries out and crumbles into a fine dust that blows about and gets breathed in by everyone nearby. In wet weather, it turns into a foul, sludgy paste coating the roads and everything that touches them. Crossing a busy street means wadding straight through it, which is precisely why crossing sweepers, usually poor boys working for whatever coins passersby will spare, make a small living clearing a path through the muck for pedestrians trying to keep their shoes clean. Along with the manure come the flies, breeding in it by the thousand, moving freely between the filth of the street and the food sitting in nearby homes and shops, carrying disease along with them as they go. The smell hangs permanently over the city, a thick, earthy stench layered directly on top of the coal smoke we've already met, and living in an Edwardian city means living surrounded, quite literally, by the byproducts of the horse, in the air, underfoot, on the sole of every shoe you own. There is genuine, serious alarm about all of this at the time. Thinkers look at the ever-growing number of horses and the ever-growing mountains of waste and worry quite sincerely about where it might all eventually end, some fearing entire cities could one day be buried beneath their own filth. It's a real problem with no obvious solution, given that the city simply cannot function without its horses. And then quietly at first comes an answer, arriving on its own noisy, unreliable terms. The motor car is beginning to appear on the streets, still a novelty, still expensive, still prone to breaking down and frightening every horse it passes, but pointing unmistakably toward a future without the manure. In time, it will solve the great sanitation crisis of the horse completely, simply by making the horse itself obsolete. Of course, the motor car brings its own fresh dangers along with it. Early motoring is chaotic. The rules of the road barely exist yet, and these machines can move considerably faster than anything that's ever shared the street before, introducing an entirely new hazard to pedestrians who have spent their whole lives dodging nothing quicker than a trotting horse. One of the darker entertainments of this age involves putting human beings on show. Alongside the ordinary fairground curiosities, grand exhibitions sometimes feature people brought from colonized parts of the world, presented as living spectacles for a paying public. It's cruelty dressed up as education and wonder, and it reflects the deeply ugly assumptions of empire running quietly beneath so much of Edwardian confidence. It deserves to be remembered honestly, rather than laughed away as a curious footnote. This is a subject that needs handling with real care, because there is nothing amusing in it, and any attempt to soften it into entertainment would be a betrayal of the people it actually harmed. This era sits at the height of empire, and empire carries with it a set of assumptions about the supposed superiority of some peoples over others. Assumptions so deeply embedded that they shape everything from politics to popular entertainment. One of the ugliest expressions of this is the practice of exhibiting human beings, treating them not as fellow people, but as curiosities to be viewed, studied, and marveled at by a paying crowd. Far more troubling still are the great exhibitions that present people brought from colonized lands as living displays. Groups of men, women, and children are sometimes housed in specially constructed settings, dressed and arranged to represent an idea of their supposedly primitive or exotic way of life, and shown to enormous crowds who come to gaze at them. These displays are often framed as educational, as a window onto the wider world. And audiences flock to them in perfectly good conscience, believing they're witnessing something instructive and wondrous. But the reality is dehumanizing in the deepest possible sense. The people on display aren't there as equals sharing their own culture on their own terms. They're positioned as specimens, evidence of a hierarchy placing the viewers comfortably at the top, and the people being viewed firmly below. The whole spectacle rests on, and actively reinforces, the assumption that these are lesser peoples, fascinating precisely because they're held to be inferior. Behind the crowds and the ticket sales sit real human beings, taken far from home, put on show, and stripped of their dignity for the entertainment and self-satisfaction of strangers. It matters to see this plainly, because it wasn't the work of a few unusual villains operating at the margins. It was mainstream, popular, and entirely respectable, enjoyed by ordinary families, and presented by established, well-regarded institutions. The same society priding itself on its civilization and its progress could line up cheerfully to view other human beings as curiosities, and feel perfectly comfortable doing so. We look back on this now with justified discomfort and shame, and rightly so. For a young woman of the upper classes, the great business of life is marriage, and it's arranged with roughly the romance of a livestock auction. The social season exists largely to introduce eligible daughters to suitable husbands, and a good match can secure an entire family's fortunes for a generation. Once married, a woman has few independent rights over her own property or even her own person, and no vote at all. Love is a pleasant bonus, if it happens to arrive. The real transaction is made in property and in name. For a young woman of good family, life builds steadily toward a single defining event, a suitable marriage, and an enormous amount of effort, expectation, and social machinery is devoted to bringing it about. The whole enterprise is conducted with a seriousness that has very little to do with romance, and a great deal to do with money, status, and the continued advancement of the families involved. A marriage is an alliance, a merging of fortunes and names, and the choice of partner is considered far too important to be left entirely to the whims of the two young people actually involved. The mechanism for arranging all of this is the social season, an elaborate calendar of balls, dinners, and gatherings during which eligible young women are formally introduced to society, and crucially, to the pool of suitable young men. A daughter is presented, dressed carefully, and put on display in the ballrooms and drawing rooms of exactly the right people, so that she might be seen, admired, and ideally chosen. Beneath its glittering surface of music and fashion, the season is, quite plainly, a carefully organized marketplace, and everyone involved understands precisely what's being traded. The stakes are especially high for the woman herself. A good marriage can secure her entire future and elevate her family's standing considerably, while failing to marry well, or failing to marry at all, can mean a precarious future as a dependent spinster, reliant on relatives and pitied quietly by polite society. A young woman's value in this particular market is measured by her family's wealth and standing, by her beauty and accomplishments, and by her conduct, which must remain impeccable, since even a hint of scandal can ruin her prospects entirely. Once the match is made and the marriage accomplished, the woman enters a state where her independence is sharply curtailed. Although reform has begun to improve matters, particularly around a married woman's ability to own property in her own right, a wife still occupies a subordinate position within her own household, expected to defer to her husband, manage his home, bear and raise his children, and conduct herself as a supporting figure in his life rather than as an equal partner. Her identity is, in large part, absorbed entirely into his. She cannot vote, a right denied to all women regardless of station, and her sphere remains firmly domestic, however clever or capable she might personally be. This is the exact context in which the growing movement for women's rights is gathering real force, as women increasingly refuse to accept these limits and demand a voice, an education, a profession, and a genuine say in their own lives. This era sits right in the middle of rising agitation on precisely these questions, and the campaigners fighting for the vote and for wider freedoms are challenging the very assumptions underpinning the marriage market and everything built around it. But for the conventional young woman of the upper classes, the path still runs clear and narrow. From the schoolroom to the season, to the altar, guided every step of the way toward the good match meant to define the rest of her life. Home ought to be the safe place, and yet the Edwardian house carries a quiet appetite for catastrophe all its own. Most rooms are lit by gas or by open flame, meaning naked fire burns in nearly every room of the house, with the constant, ordinary possibility of a leak, an explosion, or a stray spark finding something flammable close by. Add heavy fabric, wooden furniture, and long skirts drifting a little too near the hearth, and a cozy family evening carries a low, steady hum of genuine danger, running quietly underneath all that comfort. The heart of the danger is simply how homes are lit and heated, relying overwhelmingly on open flame of one kind or another. Rooms are warmed by coal fires in the grate, lit by gas fixtures on the wall or candles, and oil lamps on the table, meaning a typical Edwardian home contains several live flames at any given moment, in the fireplace, in the lamps, in the wall fittings. The soft, warm glow we find so romantic in old photographs was produced, quite literally, by burning things in the middle of rooms full of other things that would very much rather not catch fire. Gas lighting, which lights many homes and streets by this point, brings its own particular hazards. Gas is piped directly into the house and burned at fixtures to produce light, which works perfectly well when everything goes as intended. But gas can leak, filling a room with an invisible, dangerous vapor that can poison anyone breathing it in, or worse, ignite suddenly when it meets an open flame or a stray spark. A gas leak is a genuine, serious peril, and the combination of piped flammable gas running alongside open flame throughout the same house is, in hindsight, a recipe for disaster that people simply live with as an ordinary fact of life. Then there's fire itself, the ever-present risk in a world lit and warmed entirely by flame. A candle knocked over, a lamp overturned, a spark leaping from an open grate, a wall fixture sitting a little too close to a curtain. Any one of these can start a blaze, and the Edwardian home offers no shortage of fuel to help it along. Houses are full of flammable material, heavy fabric curtains and upholstery, wooden furniture, rugs, clothing, all ready to catch and spread a fire quickly through a home before much can realistically be done to stop it. One particular hazard deserves special mention, because it falls so heavily on women and children: the danger posed by clothing near an open fire. The long, flowing skirts and dresses fashionable this decade, made from fabrics that catch a light easily, brush and drift near open hearths in the ordinary course of an evening. A woman standing too close to the grate, a child playing nearby, a hem catching a light with terrible speed, and terrible consequences following close behind. These accidents are a real, well-recognized danger, a grim hazard hidden inside the simple act of standing by the fire to keep warm. Safer domestic technology is on its way: better lighting, better heating, and the electricity that will eventually replace so many open flames. But it's far from universal yet. Electricity is arriving in some homes, promising cleaner, safer light. For most people, though, the flame still rules the household, and with it, the constant, low-level risk that the cozy home might, in one unlucky moment, turn against the very people it's meant to shelter. Fashion in this era isn't only uncomfortable, on occasion, it's genuinely lethal. Some of the beautiful dyes used to color clothing and household decoration contain arsenic, shedding poison quietly onto the skin of the person wearing it. Decorative combs and hair ornaments are frequently made from celluloid, an early plastic with an alarming tendency to catch fire without warning. And the flowing, delicate fabrics everyone finds so fashionable go up almost like paper the instant they meet an open flame. Looking your very best, on a bad enough day, could genuinely be the last thing you ever do. We've already met the corset and its slow, quiet compression, and the long skirts drifting dangerously toward the fire. But the perils of dress reach further still, right down into the colors and materials of the garments themselves. The pursuit of beauty leads, as it so often does in this age, straight into a chemistry set, and some of that chemistry is quietly hostile to the very person wearing it. Take the vivid green that's been so fashionable lately, a rich, brilliant shade prized for gowns, decorations, and artificial flowers alike. Some of the most striking greens of this period are produced using compounds of arsenic, which give a wonderfully intense color while being genuinely poisonous underneath it. Garments and decorations dyed this way can shed traces of the poison, putting real risk onto both the people who wear them and, even more so, the people who make them, handling the toxic material constantly with their bare hands. The most beautiful color in the room could quite literally be poisoning the people standing nearest to admire it. Then there are the decorative items made from celluloid, one of the very first plastics, popular now for combs, hair ornaments, and small fashionable trinkets. Celluloid can be molded and colored attractively and cheaply, making it a wonderful material for affordable finery. It carries, however, one spectacularly poor quality, a strong tendency to catch fire, and to do so with startling speed and violence. A celluloid comb worn in the hair, brought too close to a flame, or even subjected to enough friction and heat, can ignite suddenly, turning a pretty ornament into a genuine and terrifying danger perched right against the wearer's head. Beyond these specific hazards sits the general flammability of the clothing itself, the light, delicate, voluminous fabrics fashion currently adores. The airy muslins and gauzy materials that make a gown look wonderfully ethereal are exactly the sort of fabric that burns easily. And as we've already seen, the world these women move through is thoroughly full of open flame waiting to meet them. Put it all together, and the fashionable Edwardian woman in particular finds herself surrounded by hazard woven directly into her own appearance. A poisonous dye here, a flammable ornament there, a delicate fabric ready to catch, a tight lace restricting her breath, all in the service of looking correct. There runs a dark thread through the whole of it, this era's willingness to sacrifice health and safety on the altar of appearance, again and again, in cosmetics, in corsetry, in color, in cloth. Looking the part matters enormously here, so much so that a certain amount of danger is simply, quietly, accepted as the price of it. And so the long day ends, though not equally for everyone beneath the same roof. The family retires into warmed beds and drawn curtains, the fires that were lit and tended by other hands still glowing gently in the grate. High above them, or perhaps in a cramped room near the kitchen, the servants who have run the entire household from before dawn until well past dark finally lie down themselves, for a few short hours, before the whole cycle begins again tomorrow. For the family, the end of the day is a gentle descent into comfort. The beds have been warmed in advance. The curtains are drawn against the cold and whatever fog has settled outside. The rooms are as pleasant as an Edwardian home can be made. They undress, with help if they're grand enough to need it, and settle into linen prepared for them, drifting off in the warmest, best appointed rooms in the entire building. The day's real labor having belonged, almost entirely, to somebody else. For the servants, night arrives quite differently. Their work continues until the family is fully settled, the last tasks finished, the fires banked for the night, the house made ready for the morning to come, and only then, long after the household above has gone to bed, do they finally climb the stairs to their own quarters. And those quarters are the plainest, coldest rooms in the building. A bare attic beneath the roof, or a cramped room near the basement, sparsely furnished and barely heated at all. A world away from the warmth they've spent the entire day providing for someone else. That single contrast, the warm bedroom above, the cold attic beneath, both sitting under one roof, holds inside it much of what this whole day has shown us. The comfort and elegance of the Edwardian world are entirely real, but they rest on the labor, the hardship, and often the quiet suffering of other people, and the further down you look, the clearer that becomes. The danger, as we've seen across this long imagined day, runs through every single level of that world, high and low alike. In the powder on a fashionable face, in the tonic on the medicine shelf, in the smoke over the city and the milk on the breakfast table, in the corset, the comb, the curtain hanging too near the flame. The Edwardians move through all of it with a kind of remarkable composure, because to them, it's simply the world, ordinary, unremarkable, the way things have always been. That perhaps is the strangest thing of all, how normal it feels to the people actually living inside it. What looks to us like an obstacle course of hazard and hardship was, to them, just daily life, navigated without much of a second thought, its dangers so familiar they'd become almost invisible. So as the house falls silent, warm rooms and cold attics settling into whatever rest the night allows each of them, we come to the end of our day inside Edwardian England. You powdered your face with lead this morning, dosed your nerves at the chemist's, ate bread padded with chalk, and drank milk that was quietly working against you the whole time. You laced yourself into a shape your own ribs never quite agreed to, breathed air thick enough to taste, and shared your weekly bath with half the household standing in line behind you. And through all of it, you smiled, stayed polite, and carried on as though everything were perfectly lovely, because that in the end was simply the Edwardian way. It's easy to smile gently at how strange it all sounds from here, and we have, tonight, here and there. But behind the strangeness were real people, living real lives, carrying burdens we can barely begin to imagine now. The servants who rose long before dawn, the children who worked impossibly long hours, the mothers who faced impossible choices with no good options in front of them, the workers slowly poisoned by the very things their own hands made, and the countless ordinary people who simply got on with it, day after difficult day, because there was nothing else to do. They weren't fragile, whatever the corsets and the fainting couches might suggest. They were patient, they were tough, and they were quietly, unremarkably heroic in the way that ordinary endurance always is. And the comfortable world we live in now was built, in no small part, on exactly that endurance. So tonight, as you settle into your own warm bed, with clean water only a tap away, safe food waiting in the kitchen, and air outside your window that you can breathe without a second thought, maybe spare a small, quiet thank you for the people who came before you and carried all of this so that you wouldn't have to. Everything we've walked through so far assumes a household with at least some means. A family that owns a corset, sends its children half-time to a mill rather than full-time, and can afford a chemist's bottle when the nerves act up. But a very large share of the population lives somewhere considerably harder than that, packed into the crowded, airless streets that respectable visitors rarely bother to walk down. In the poorest districts of the big industrial cities, entire families might share a single room, one room for cooking, sleeping, working, and everything else that happens in a life. Walls are thin enough that a neighbor's cough travels through them as clearly as if it were happening in your own bed. Damp climbs up from the ground and down from the roof at the same time, blackening the plaster, and in winter it never really leaves. There is no going outside to escape the cold, because outside is a narrow court hemmed in on every side by more of the same buildings, blocking whatever daylight might otherwise reach the ground. Water for the whole court often comes from a single shared pump or standpipe, meaning a trip outside with a bucket, in all weather, simply to have something to cook with or wash in. A privy shared between a dozen families or more sits at the end of the court, and on a hot summer day, the smell from it settles over the whole street and doesn't lift. Rubbish accumulates because there is nowhere organized for it to go, and it breeds exactly the sort of vermin you'd expect. Fever moves through courts like this with terrible speed, because there is no space between one family and the next for it to lose momentum. And yet within these conditions, ordinary life carries on with its own dignity. Doorsteps get scrubbed obsessively, even when the walls behind them are crumbling, because a clean step in front of a poor house is one of the few visible signs of respectability a family can control. Children play in the court because there is nowhere else to play. Neighbors lend each other pennies, mind each other's bobbies, and share what little food is spare. Because in conditions this tight, community is not a nicety, it is survival. Reformers of the period, walking through these same streets with notebooks and cameras, produce reports that shock the comfortable reading public, full of numbers about overcrowding and disease that read almost unbelievably today. Slowly, painfully slowly, some of the worst of these courts get condemned and cleared, replaced eventually by newer housing with actual sanitation built in. But that change comes gradually, street by street, and for now, A very large portion of the working population lives exactly as we've just described. Only a short walk from the drawing rooms and tea trays, we spent the earlier part of this evening inside. Not everything about the evening is grim, and it's worth remembering that this era also knows exactly how to have a good time. After the shops close and the fog settles in, the music hall lights up, and for the price of admission that even a working family can usually stretch to on a Saturday, an entire evening of noise, color, and laughter is waiting inside. Picture the hall itself, gaslit, a little smoky, packed tight with rows of seats and standing room at the back, a stage lined with painted scenery that gets swapped act after act. A chairman sits near the front with a gavel, introducing each act and keeping the rowdier members of the crowd roughly in line. Onto the stage come singers with catchy, sentimental songs the whole room already knows the words to. Comic performers doing exaggerated impressions of nagging wives or henpecked husbands, acrobats, ventriloquists, a strong man lifting something absurdly heavy to gasps and applause. The audience is not a quiet one. People sing along loudly with the choruses, heckle the acts they don't care for, and roar with laughter at jokes that lean heavily on class, on marriage, on the various indignities of ordinary daily life, jokes that work precisely because everyone in the room recognizes exactly what's being poked fun at. For a few hours, the corset can be loosened a notch, the workhouse can be forgotten entirely, and the whole room can simply enjoy itself. The music hall is also, in its own way, one of the few places where social lines blur a little. A clerk and a factory hand might find themselves standing shoulder to shoulder at the back, singing the same chorus with the same enthusiasm. It's not equality, exactly. The boxes and better seats are still reserved for those who can pay more. But for one evening, everyone in the building is laughing at the same joke, and that counts for something in a world otherwise so carefully arranged by rank. Step away from the entertainment for a moment and consider how word actually travels in this world, because it shapes daily life more than you might expect. The postal service is remarkably efficient for its time. In the cities, several deliveries a day are entirely normal, meaning a letter posted in the morning might reasonably expect a reply by the afternoon. It is, in its own quiet way, a kind of everyday magic that this generation takes almost entirely for granted, the way we take a phone notification for granted. For anything urgent, there's the telegram, clattering in over the wires and delivered by a boy on a bicycle, usually dressed in a smart little uniform, pedaling hard, because a telegram means something important enough to justify the extra cost. A telegram arriving at the door produces an immediate lurch of anxiety in most households, because the format itself, short, clipped, stripped of any unnecessary word to save money on each one, makes even good news sound faintly alarming. Telegrams announce births, deaths, job offers, and warnings of arrival, all in the same terse, breathless style, and a family that receives one tends to gather round the doorstep to hear it read aloud before anyone dares open the envelope. Newspapers, meanwhile, are cheaper and more widely read than ever before, thanks to a whole generation now able to read them, courtesy of the compulsory schooling we touched on earlier. Multiple editions come out through the day, criers on street corners shouting the day's biggest headline to draw in customers, and an entire industry of illustrated papers and penny magazines competes for attention alongside them, filled with serialized fiction, sensational crime reporting, and society gossip in roughly equal measure. For many ordinary households, the evening paper is the one genuine luxury of the day: a chair by the fire, a cup of tea, and half an hour spent catching up with the wider world before bed. For those with even a little spare money and a little spare time, the seaside holiday has become one of the great pleasures of the era, made possible almost entirely by the railway. A family that could never have dreamed of traveling any real distance a generation earlier can now, for a modest fare, spend a week by the sea, And resorts up and down the coast have grown entire industries around exactly this desire. Picture the scene on arrival, a promenade lined with guest houses, each one competing for custom with a slightly grander sign than the last, donkeys plodding along the sand giving rides to children, a pier stretching out over the water lined with stalls, amusements, and a bandstand playing music in the salt air. Bathing machines sit at the water's edge, small wooden huts on wheels, pulled down into the shallows by a horse or a hired attendant, allowing a bather to change in modest privacy and step directly into the sea without being seen doing so by the crowds on the beach, since mixed bathing in anything approaching modern swimwear would be considered thoroughly scandalous. The food is simple and cheerful, whelks and cockles from a stall, fish and chips wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, sticks of rock candy stamped with the resort's name running all the way through the middle in a way that delights every child who's ever snapped one in half to check. In the evening, there might be a concert party on the pier, or a Punch and Judy show drawing a crowd of children on the sand, gasping and laughing at exactly the same jokes their parents laughed at as children themselves. For a factory worker or a shop assistant, a week like this is the one real escape the whole year offers. A chance to breathe air that isn't thick with coal smoke, to feel sand instead of cobblestones underfoot, and to come home a little sunburned, a little poorer, and considerably more rested than they left. And since we've walked through nearly every corner of an ordinary day, it seems only right to end with the one day of the year that looks, even now, most recognizably like our own. Christmas in this era has already taken on much of the shape we'd know today. A decorated tree in the parlor, cards exchanged by post weeks in advance, carol singers going door to door collecting a few coins for their trouble, and a goose, or, for those who can afford it, a turkey roasting in the kitchen for hours, filling the whole house with a warmth that, for one day at least, has nothing to do with coal. For children, the day begins with a stocking hung at the end of the bed, filled with small treats, an orange, a handful of nuts, a few pennies, perhaps a small wooden toy if the family can manage it. For wealthier households, there are proper presents wrapped and placed beneath the tree, while for poorer families, Christmas generosity often comes from church charities, works clubs, or wealthier neighbors distributing baskets of food and small gifts to families who couldn't otherwise manage much of a celebration at all. The day itself is built around the table. Extended family crowd into whatever space the house has, extra chairs borrowed from a neighbor, the good china brought out for the one time all year it gets properly used. There are games afterward, charades, blind man's buff, parlor tricks that have been passed down through the family for generations. And, if the household can run to it, a small glass of something warm to mark the occasion properly. For one single day, the rigid lines of the rest of the year soften just slightly. Even in households where servants keep to their own quarters the other 364 days of the year, Christmas often brings some small gesture across that divide, an extra portion of food sent down to the kitchen, a small gift, a half-day granted so the household staff might see their own families for once. It doesn't erase the gap between upstairs and downstairs that's run through this entire evening. But for one day, it narrows just a little, before the ordinary rhythm of the Edwardian world resumes again the following morning. We touched earlier on the marriage market and the narrow legal position of a married woman, but it would be a disservice to this era to leave the story there. Because right now, in the middle of this decade, a growing number of women are refusing to accept that narrow position quietly. The campaign for the vote has moved well past polite petitions and into something considerably louder, and it's reshaping the public conversation in ways that make a great many comfortable people extremely uneasy. The more moderate campaigners favor patient argument, public meetings, and steady pressure on sympathetic politicians, believing change will come through persistence and reasoned persuasion. A more militant wing has grown impatient with that pace entirely and has turned to direct action instead, smashing windows along fashionable shopping streets, chaining themselves to railings outside government buildings, disrupting political meetings with a single shouted question that a speaker very obviously doesn't want to answer. These are deliberate, planned acts of civil disobedience, calculated to make the movement impossible to ignore. The response from the authorities is often harsh. Women arrested for these acts face imprisonment, and some, once inside, refuse food entirely in protest, prompting a policy of force-feeding that is, by any description, brutal. A tube forced down the throat while the prisoner is physically restrained, repeated as often as required to keep her alive. News of this treatment, when it reaches the public, shocks even a good many people who have no particular sympathy for the cause itself. The wider public reaction to all of this is deeply divided. Newspapers run cartoons mocking suffrage campaigners as unfeminine and hysterical, while other papers, and a growing number of ordinary readers, quietly start to wonder whether a movement willing to endure imprisonment and forced feeding for the sake of a ballot paper might actually have a point worth listening to. Husbands argue with wives across the dinner table. Daughters argue with mothers who find the whole business undignified. It is, in short, one of the genuinely live, unsettled arguments of the age, and nobody sitting at that dinner table yet knows how it will end, though within a decade or so, the vote will begin to arrive, first for some women, eventually for all. If travel by seaside train sounded pleasant a little earlier, an ordinary railway journey deserves its own moment, because the railway has changed the shape of daily life for absolutely everyone in this era, in ways that are easy to take for granted after only a generation or two of having it. Arrive at a station, and the first thing that hits you is the noise, the hiss and clank of a steam locomotive idling at the platform, porters calling out, a guard's whistle somewhere further down the platform signaling departure for a different train entirely. Smoke and steam curl up into the great glass roof overhead, catching the light in a way that even hardened commuters still occasionally pause to notice. Which class of carriage you travel in says a great deal about you, and everyone on the platform can read those signals instantly. First class means a private, cushioned compartment, quiet enough to read the paper in real comfort. Third class means hard wooden benches, a compartment packed with as many bodies as will fit, and considerably more noise, but it's also cheap enough that ordinary working people can now travel distances their grandparents would never have dreamed of covering in a single day. This single fact, more than almost any other, is what makes the seaside holiday, the day trip to visit family in another town, and eventually the growth of whole new suburbs, possible at all. The train itself is not without danger. Signaling systems are still developing, and collisions do happen, sometimes with serious loss of life, prompting public inquiries and gradual safety improvements that arrive, as usual, somewhat behind the accidents that made them necessary. But for all its noise, its soot, and its occasional peril, the railway remains one of the genuine wonders of the age, a machine that has quietly, comprehensively rewired how ordinary people understand distance itself. Return, for a moment, to somewhere we've already visited once today, the shop, but this time consider it from behind the counter rather than in front of it, because working in retail in this era is its own particular kind of hardship, one that rarely gets the same attention as the mine or the mill. Shop assistants, a great many of them young women, work extraordinarily long hours, often opening before 8 in the morning and not closing again until well past 9 at night, 6 days a week, with barely a pause for a meal in between. In many shops, assistants are required to live in, sleeping in cramped dormitory rooms above or behind the premises, meaning their entire existence, working and resting alike, takes place inside the same building, under the watchful eye of the same employer around the clock. The physical demands are considerable and rarely acknowledged as demands at all. An assistant is expected to stand for the entire length of a shift, since sitting down in view of a customer is considered thoroughly unprofessional, whatever the state of one's feet by the end of a 14-hour day. Wages are low, and a portion is often docked automatically for breakages, for shortfalls in the till, or for minor infractions of house rules that can feel almost designed to be broken by someone exhausted enough. And yet shop work carries a certain social respectability that factory work does not. A shop girl, however poorly paid, is considered a cut above a mill girl in the eyes of polite society, dealing as she does with a better class of customer and wearing, at minimum, a clean, presentable uniform rather than working clothes stained by industrial labor. It's a small, telling reminder of just how finely graded this era's sense of status really is, that even among people working brutally long hours for very little money, there is still a hierarchy worth arguing about. Step into an Edwardian classroom, and the first thing you notice is the sheer number of children packed into it, rows upon rows of desks, sometimes 50 or 60 pupils under a single teacher, all facing forward, hands folded, waiting for the lesson to begin. Compulsory schooling has changed the shape of childhood enormously over the past few decades, and by this point, nearly every child, rich or poor, spends at least some years behind one of these desks. The teaching style leans heavily on repetition and discipline. Times tables are chanted aloud in unison until they're memorized beyond any possibility of forgetting. Letters are copied over and over onto slates, wiped clean and copied again. A teacher walking the aisles carries real authority, and a cane or a ruler across the knuckles is an entirely unremarkable response to a wrong answer, a smudged page, or simple inattention. Discipline here isn't considered harsh by the standards of the day. It's considered ordinary, even necessary, the ordinary cost of an education that would otherwise dissolve into chaos with so many children in one room. Boys and girls are often taught separately, or at least seated separately within the same room, and the subjects on offer differ according to sex in ways that would look strange to modern eyes. Boys might spend part of the week on basic technical drawing or woodwork, preparing them, in theory, for a trade. Girls spend a comparable stretch of time on needlework and domestic skills, preparing them, just as deliberately, for running a household of their own one day. Reading, writing, and arithmetic form the shared core underneath all of it, alongside a good deal of scripture and moral instruction, since a school's job in this period is understood to include building character every bit as much as building literacy. For a working-class family, sending a child to school at all represents a real sacrifice, because every hour spent at a desk is an hour not spent earning, and the half-time system we touched on earlier exists precisely because so many families genuinely cannot afford to give up that income entirely. Attendance officers go from door to door chasing down children who have stopped showing up, because truancy is treated as seriously as any other legal infraction. And for all its rigidity, its cane, and its crowded desks, this system is producing something genuinely new. A generation of working people who can read a newspaper, write a letter, and follow a wage slip, in a way their own parents very often could not. As the evening wears on and the music hall crowd spills back out onto the street, a great many of them are heading somewhere else first. The public house, standing on nearly every corner of a working-class neighborhood, warm, loud, and lit against the fog outside. The pub is not simply a place to drink, though drinking is very much the point of the evening for plenty of the people inside it. It's one of the few genuinely warm, well-lit, sociable spaces available to an ordinary working person after a long shift, and it functions as something close to community's living room. Men gather round the bar swapping news and gossip, playing dominoes or cards in a corner booth, occasionally breaking into a song everyone in the room happens to know. Women are present too, though the etiquette around exactly where and how a respectable woman drinks is considerably more complicated than it is for a man, and plenty of pubs maintain a separate, more discreet area specifically for female customers, away from the noisier main bar. Landlords keep a close, practical eye on the room, since a rowdy pub risks losing its license entirely, and a license, once granted, is valuable enough that most publicans have every incentive to keep order. Drink itself carries real weight as a social problem in this era, and temperance campaigners argue loudly and often that it's responsible for a great deal of the poverty, violence, and neglect running through working-class life. An argument with genuine truth behind it in plenty of individual households, even as millions of other people manage a pint or two on a Saturday night without it touching their lives at all. The pub, in the end, sits at the center of a real tension in Edwardian life, a source of genuine warmth and community for a great many people, and a genuine source of real harm for others, with very little space in between to tell, from the outside, which version of the evening any particular drinker is actually having. Somewhere out there in the fog-thickened street, a constable is walking his beat, and it's worth spending a moment with him, because policing in this era looks quite different from what came before it, and quite different again from what will come after. The Edwardian police force is a relatively young institution, still building the public trust and authority we'd now take entirely for granted, and a constable on his beat carries surprisingly little in the way of equipment. A wooden truncheon, a whistle to summon help if trouble genuinely breaks out, and a lantern to light his way through streets with patchy gas lighting at best. His main tool, really, is his own physical presence. A steady, visible patrol through the same streets night after night, known by sight to the shopkeepers and residents along his route, discouraging trouble simply by being reliably, predictably there. Crime in the poorer districts is a real and constant concern. Pickpocketing, petty theft, the occasional violent robbery, and detection methods remain fairly rudimentary by later standards. Fingerprinting is a genuinely new technique, only recently adopted and still viewed with some skepticism by older officers trained under an earlier system. Much detective work still relies heavily on informants, local knowledge, and a detective's own accumulated sense of which faces belong to which crimes, rather than anything approaching modern forensic science. Public fascination with crime runs high regardless of any of this. Newspapers report criminal trials in exhaustive, almost novelistic detail, and the more sensational cases draw crowds outside the courthouse itself, hopping for a glimpse of the accused being led in or out. A notorious murder can dominate the papers for weeks, discussed at length over the very same tea tables we visited at the start of this evening, proof that, however elegant and respectable this era likes to see itself, it retains a very healthy, very ordinary human appetite for a good, dark story. If illness in this era grows serious enough to need more than a chemist's bottle or a family remedy, the next stop is the hospital, though it's worth understanding just how different this institution is from the one we picture today, and how much it still depends on charity rather than any organized system of public funding. Most hospitals of this period are voluntary institutions, kept running through donations from wealthy patrons, church collections, and fundraising events held specifically to keep the wards open. A patient's experience inside one can vary enormously depending on which hospital they've reached and which ward they've been placed in. The wealthy rarely see the inside of a public ward at all, since a doctor can be brought to a comfortable bedroom at home for a private consultation, and if necessary, a private operation performed right there, on the kitchen table if that's what the light and space allow. For everyone else, the hospital ward is a long room lined with iron bedsteads, kept scrupulously clean by the standards of the age, following the germ theory that has genuinely transformed medical thinking over the past few decades. Nursing itself has been reshaped entirely by the reforming influence of a certain famous nurse from the previous generation, and a hospital matron now runs her ward with a discipline that would be recognizable to a military officer. Strict routines, spotless linen, absolute obedience from her junior nurses, most of whom are young, unmarried women living in on-site accommodation, not unlike the servants and shop assistants we met earlier tonight. Surgery has advanced considerably. Anesthesia means a patient can be genuinely unconscious throughout an operation rather than held down and gritting through it. An antiseptic technique means a wound is now far less likely to turn fatally septic afterward than it would have been a single generation earlier. These are real, hard-won advances, and they've saved a great many lives that an earlier era would simply have lost. But hospital care remains, for the poorest patients, something approached with genuine dread rather than comfort, since a stay in a public ward often means an admission of poverty every bit as visible and shamming as a spell in the workhouse itself. And the two institutions, in the popular imagination, sit rather closer together than the doctors running them would probably like to admit. Return, for a final glimpse, to the grander end of Edwardian society, and consider the formal dinner party, one of the great social rituals of the wealthy household, governed by rules so intricate that an entire book could be written on the correct arrangement of a table alone. Guests arrive dressed with real precision, evening dress for the men, elaborate gowns and careful jewelry for the women, every detail calibrated to signal exactly the right degree of wealth and taste without tipping over into vulgar excess. Seating at the table is arranged with equal precision, following a strict order of social rank, so that the placement cards laid at each setting carry real diplomatic weight, capable of causing genuine offense if a guest finds themselves seated further from the host than their standing warrants. The meal itself unfolds across many courses: soup, fish, a meat course, game, a sweet course, and finally cheese and fruit, each one accompanied by its own appropriate wine, served in careful sequence by footmen trained to anticipate a guest's needs before they're even voiced aloud. Conversation follows its own unwritten rules too. Certain topics are considered entirely unsuitable for the table. Politics grown too heated, anything touching on money directly, anything remotely indelicate, and a skilled hostess steers the conversation firmly away from any of it the moment it threatens to arise. Behind the elegant surface of all this sits, once again, an enormous amount of invisible labor. The kitchen below stairs has been working since early morning to produce a meal this elaborate, timed with military precision, so that each course arrives at exactly the right moment, still hot, perfectly presented. A single misstep by a nervous new footman, a soup served a few degrees too cool, can become the subject of quiet, cutting commentary among the guests for weeks afterward. It is, in miniature, everything we've walked through this entire evening: genuine elegance on the surface, built entirely on the labor of people the guests at the table will barely notice at all. Look around almost any comfortable Edwardian parlor, and you'll find small, quiet evidence of just how far this country's reach currently extends. Tea from India or Ceylon in the caddy, sugar from the Caribbean in the bowl, a carved ivory ornament from somewhere in Africa, displayed on the mantelpiece as a curious souvenir rather than as evidence of anything troubling. This is an empire that has made its way, quite literally, into the smallest domestic details of daily life, and most people living inside it give this fact very little conscious thought at all. Maps of the world hang in schoolrooms with a considerable portion of the globe colored in the same shade of red or pink, representing territory under British rule, and children are taught to feel a certain pride at the sheer scale of that coloring, without much accompanying discussion of what that rule actually means for the people living under it. Newspapers report on colonial affairs with a confidence that assumes British administration is, on balance, a civilizing, beneficial force in the world, and this assumption goes largely unquestioned in respectable circles, even as a smaller number of critics and campaigners begin, quietly, to push back against it. Soldiers returning from postings in India or Africa bring back stories, souvenirs, and photographs that circulate through families and social clubs, shaping a popular image of distant lands as exotic, sometimes dangerous, and always somehow in need of British order. It's a confidence that runs very deep in this era, wrapped up entirely with the sense of progress and civilization. This whole evening has kept circling back to the same confidence that filled the medicine cabinet with miracle cures and the parlor with eugenics pamphlets, now extended outward across the map of the entire world. For all the grim detail we've spent this evening walking through, it's worth pausing on something genuinely thrilling about this particular decade, because the Edwardians are living through one of the most exciting bursts of new technology their world has ever seen, and the sense of wonder around it is entirely real. The motor car, still a novelty when we passed one earlier tonight, is rapidly becoming less of a curiosity and more of a genuine possibility for anyone with sufficient means. And enthusiasts speak about it with the same breathless excitement a later century will reserve for space travel. Aeroplanes, barely a few years old as a working idea, are now managing sustained, controlled flights that fill newspaper front pages and draw enormous crowds to watch a man in goggles wobble uncertainly across a field a few hundred feet above the ground, an achievement that would have sounded like pure fantasy only a decade earlier. The telephone is spreading steadily through wealthier homes and offices, allowing a conversation to happen in real time across a distance that would once have required a letter and several days' wait. Electric lighting, still far from universal as we noted earlier, is nonetheless arriving in more and more homes, promising an end to the constant low hum of fire risk that's run underneath so much of tonight's story. Even the humble bicycle has quietly reshaped daily life for millions of ordinary people, offering cheap, independent transport that a factory worker or shop assistant could genuinely afford, opening up courtship, employment, and simple leisure to people who'd never before had the means to travel more than walking distance from home. There's a genuine, infectious optimism running through all of this, a widespread sense that the new century is going to solve problems the last one simply couldn't. And in fairness, on several fronts, it eventually will. But it's worth remembering, too, everything we've already walked through this evening. The same scientific confidence that's building aeroplanes and telephones is also the confidence that put lead in face powder, arsenic in complexion wafers, and radium in a health tonic, entirely certain of its own progress in every single case. For those with a little more money than a music hall ticket requires, or simply a taste for something a touch more refined, the West End Theatre offers an entirely different kind of evening, and it's worth stepping inside for a moment before we finally let the whole household settle down to sleep. The grand playhouses of the city are lit by electric light now rather than the older gas footlights, considerably reducing one particular risk we discussed earlier, and the auditoriums themselves are lavish spaces, gilt and red velvet, tiered up into private boxes where the wealthiest patrons can be seen quite as much as they come to see the performance itself. A well-known actor-manager might headline his own company, and audiences follow their favorite performers from production to production with something close to modern celebrity devotion. Discussing their latest role over the very dinner tables we visited a little earlier tonight. The plays on offer range from serious drama to lighter comedy to the increasingly popular musical comedy, blending song, spectacle, and a fairly thin plot into an evening of pure, undemanding entertainment. Melodrama remains hugely popular too, full of clear villains, virtuous heroines, and last-minute rescues that draw genuine gasps and hisses from an audience fully willing to lose themselves in the story for a few hours. Between acts, the foyer becomes its own small social stage, where seeing and being seen matters every bit as much as the play itself. Conversation flowing about who's wearing what, who's been seen with whom, all conducted in the same careful, coded language of status that's run through nearly every scene we've visited this evening, from the ballroom to the dinner table to the theater foyer itself. We've walked through a great deal tonight: cold mornings and poison face powder, Chemist shelves and adulterated bread, Servants rising before dawn and children bent over factory machines, mines and match factories, hospitals and asylums, ballrooms and picket lines. And finally, a theater foyer lit by electric light against a sky still thick with coal smoke outside. It's a strange, layered world to hold in your mind all at once, genuinely elegant in places, genuinely cruel in others, often both of those things at exactly the same moment, in the very same house. The Edwardians themselves rarely paused to notice the contradiction, because it was simply the water they swam in, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone living inside it. The way our own everyday contradictions will look strange, one day, to whoever studies us next. So let the fog settle back down over the street outside. Let the last lamp in the house finally go dark, and let yourself drift off now, warm and safe in a world with clean water, safe food, and antibiotics this era never had. Rest well tonight. There's nowhere else you need to be until morning.